Welcome to everybody. This conference, EUWONDER conference. Before starting this conference, I want to express my deep solidarity and support to Israeli people and Palestinians. One of our panelists, Sophia Solomon, will hold her presentation tomorrow from her home in Israel under the threat posed by the barbaric assault that we are witnessing. Then strong support to Sophia, to all Israeli citizens and all innocent Palestinians who are suffering the pain caused by another tragic conflict. And now we can kick off our conference saying very few words, I promise, about the chair, the EUWONDER chair, under which this workshop has been organized. European Women's Law and Gender Action, EUWONDER chair, addresses the topic of gender equality within the European legal order. It discusses the perspectives of the integration of gender analysis at all levels of policies and regulation, with a commitment to equality and anti-discrimination, trying to promote intersectionality as a cross-cutting vision in European law and policies within the EU Gender Equality Strategy 2020-2025. EUWONDER aims at achieving innovative teaching, training practices, and policy recommendations grounded on scientific research, enhancing the network that we built by the ELAN module, the Jean Monnet Action module that we developed since 2019 to 2022. What did we do during the last year of the EUWONDER chair? In the last academic year, the academic year 2022-2023, we held a general course on law and gender at this department, the Department of Law, and another course on European law and gender dedicated to the peace studies students at the University of Pisa. Then we had 5 very important seminars, Stefano Sella, Barbara De Micheli, Mara Malagodi, Ruth Rubio Marín, and Natalia Rueda Vallejo. These seminars were dedicated to the PhD students, but we had also undergraduate students and I can say a general audience. And we focused on the topic of gender identity, anti-discrimination policies, third gender in Asia, global constitutionalism, and women's rights in the inter-American system of human rights. I believe that an absolutely innovative experience was that of the transdisciplinary course on gender studies and interdisciplinary perspectives that we held in 2023, collecting several students, I can see also today, some of them, coming from very different backgrounds, philosophy, economics, political sciences, but also chemistry, biology, data science. It was a very challenging experience, this transdisciplinary course that we are going to renew also during this academic year 2023-2024. Starting in November, we are organizing a training course for high school teachers devoted to the topics of European integration, gender equality, and discrimination. This course promotes awareness and the focused knowledge on European legislation, of course, in the field of gender equality. We will propose innovative approaches in civic education at high schools, a sort of gender-oriented civic education in high schools. And I hope that this can be an important step towards the building of a gender-oriented civic education in schools, because I can say in Italy, I believe that we particularly need this sort of engagement in this moment. In spring 2024, we have scheduled a course for University of Pisa administrative personnel on gender equality. At the end, I want to mention another initiative that we had in May on the topic of obstetrical violence. It was a deep interdisciplinary debate among jurists, lawyers, clinicians, experts on gender issues, and women involved in the phenomenon of obstetrical violence. And we had aimed to contribute to the European discussion on the regulation of obstetrical violence within the framework of the gender medicine. Now, we should have our project officer, European Commission project officer, but I can't see her in Teams. Then maybe we have later the intervention of Olga Marín, that is the European Commission's project officer of the EUWONDER chair. But now I'm very glad, I'm very honored to give the floor, to kick off our workshop, giving the floor to Ruth Rubio Marín. Ruth Rubio Marín, you all know, of course, Ruth Rubio Marín, but I have to say something to present her. She's professor of constitutional law at the Universidad de Sevilla. She's also professor at the School of Transnational Governance of the European University Institute and director of the UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Interculturalism. Over the past 20 years, she has accumulated vast experience in the field of gender constitutionalism, multiculturalism, human rights, immigration law, and citizenship theory. In such fields, she has produced an extensive corpus of international publications. She has taught students and members of civil society on the interrelation of law, gender, and diversity. She has delivered distinguished lectures and keynote speeches in some of the world-leading academic institutions. Today we have her here in Pisa. Let me just mention her seminal book, Global Gender Constitutionalism and Women's Citizenship, A Struggle for Transformative Inclusion, Cambridge University Press 2022, and the forthcoming, I'm waiting for it, please, Gender, Sexuality and Constitutionalism in Asia, edited with Mara Malagoni, that's chairing the panel and this afternoon. And now, please, Ruth, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Wow, it is so lovely to be here for so many reasons. One is that Elettra and I have been in touch. I don't know. I mean, you could hear she's a force of nature, putting all these initiatives and creating critical mass networks, encouraging younger scholars. So thank you, Elettra, for all the work you do. And it's wonderful that we're not limited to Zoom, that we can actually sometimes meet in person. It just Zoom doesn't quite do it for me. I think for most of us. It's a privilege to see all of you and to see so many friends that I hadn't seen in a very long time, and to meet some of you, and of course to speak in front of Galileo Galilei. It's always a bit of a impressive. So thank you for the opportunity. So I have a presentation for you. Let me see if I can get it. Elettra, can you help me maybe? It started with peace. Oh, it's there. There. Yeah, I can see it now. There we go. You put it in slides mode. Let me see. Okay, here we go. Now I press. But I don't have. I always get it wrong. Okay. Constitutional ammunition of the anti-gender equality movement. You see, I slightly changed my title. So basically, I don't have to tell you that during the last 15 years or so, we've been witnessing a true gender war of constitutional dimensions with thousands of citizens around the world taking to the streets to either celebrate or protest against new, aspired, or achieved milestones in the conquest of rights for women and sexual and gender minorities. And I just picked for you a few images, right? Pro-life, pro-choice manifestations in the wake of Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization, death of Roe v. Wade, Poland, October 2020, protests against the ruling of the abortion case by the Constitutional Court, but also some victories. Colombia, February 22, celebrating a Constitutional Court decision that allows for abortion on demand on the 24 first weeks of pregnancy. So let me start by saying that I think that this anti-gender equality movement is in a way a reaction against a true gender revolution that seeks the disestablishment or the challenge to the traditional gender order that was in the DNA of our modern constitutional systems, because these were built around the construct of the traditional family on both sides of the Atlantic. And although it is a revolution still in the making, of course, much has changed since the time these modern constitutional systems were devised, thought. And as with every major challenge to dominant norms in the history of political thought, I think resistance to disestablishment of patriarchy and its underlying gender order was to be expected and has indeed arrived. I mean, just think of what it took in Western societies to defeat absolutist monarchies or to challenge the establishment of religion. So in a way, the backlash against gender equality is a sign of success of what women and sexual and gender dissidents have achieved in a relatively short period of time, I think, as well as a reminder that major political transformations are generally hard won and never present themselves in a linear way. So today, what I want to do, since I'm opening the conference, is maybe go quickly over some of the general features of this general anti-gender equality movement that hopefully will serve as a framework for us all. And then I will focus on 4 specific constitutional tactics that I have identified as being displayed by the movement. And I will finally conclude with some reflections. Oh, I pressed the wrong button. Here we go. So tracing the roots of the phenomenon, we must say that these neoconservative reactions by an organized transnational and increasingly global movement appeared already in the 90s in several European countries, but also elsewhere, especially in Latin America, in response to international developments, and that they built on the pre-existing infrastructure of earlier anti-abortion groups in the United States, formed in reaction to Roe v. Wade. Such international developments, including those brought about by the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, on the 4th World Conference on Women, Beijing, which foregrounded, as we all know, women's empowerment, sexual and reproductive rights, and gender as a relevant category of analysis for the purpose of understanding the proper nature of violence against women as a form of gender subordination. So these major international conferences gained relevance on the agenda of international and regional organizations such as the UN system, the EU, the Organization of American States. And this international agenda triggered in turn a defensive affirmation, which was already expressed during these international conferences by the Vatican, the Christian American Right, as well as various other states from Christian and Muslim traditions. So an anti-gender discourse was indeed fostered by the Vatican between the mid-90s and the mid-2000s through a process of building a counter-narrative, which was later socialized for the purpose of mobilizing a wider constituency that became particularly active since the 2010, relying on increasingly sophisticated funding schemes described in this amazing report that I encourage you to read if you have not already. So in a way, what is a more recent phenomenon, I would say, is the phenomenon of the last 10, 15 years is the permeation of these counter narratives into civil society, the addition of new actors in this battle, the degree of politicization of the topic, and the extent to which it has translated into constitutional lawfare, which is the specific phenomenon I will focus on in the lecture today. But before I focus on it, let me just briefly say a couple of words about the actors and the supporting narratives. So in terms of actors, the anti-gender movement currently encompasses a complex constellation in each country, which typically includes family associations, men's rights associations, anti-abortion groups, religious conservatives, nationalists and populists, mostly, though not exclusively right-wing populists, far-right groups, conservative legal think tanks, and leaders from various confessions, Catholic, evangelicals, Pentecostals, but also Muslims and Jews. The discourses vary, uh, but they actually resonate, whatever the dominant discourse, they resonate, these various discourses against gender ideology resonate with several ongoing debates in Western societies. And I think many of the presentations that we will hear in these 2 days will show this, including nationalist and racial anxieties tied to demographic concerns. Demographic anxieties are particularly strong in Russia, Turkey, and part of Eastern Europe, but they have also gained traction in the United States among white supremacist demographic fears, backed by the idea of a widened Christian civilization under threat, the so-called replacement theory. These anxieties also somehow resonate with the church's foretelling of an anthropological revolution leading to the self-destruction of humanity, unless a new human ecology comes to its rescue. Resistance to globalization has also fueled the return of the national in many European societies that several populist and far-right forces are agitating, taking advantage of the generalized discontent with economic and employment prospects for both the working and middle class in neoliberal economies, especially after the financial crisis and austerity measures. A certain narrative of post-colonialism is also present and especially dominant in the African continent, where in spite of some celebrated progressive milestones, the criminalization of abortion and homosexuality remains unfortunately the norm, and where Christianity is fast expanding thanks in part to American support and funding. And Islamic conservative forces, including but not limited to those backing political Islam, have also reacted against the supposed imposition of Western values, which they see as contrary to the traditional Sharia-inspired Muslim family, foregrounding the complementarity of gender roles rather than any notion of strict gender equality. Now, the symbolic glue, as Andreas Pitto has called it, bringing all of these actors and narratives together seems to be the need to combat gender ideology. And by this notion, they mean anything which can in somehow be perceived as a challenge to the traditional family and the natural law of creation, as well as to disavow academic currents that question essentialism and the traditional gender order system and roles. And a whole quite diversified package of authors are accused of Simone de Beauvoir, Adrienne Rich, but of course, the demon, Judith Butler, is the first target. And as to the ammunition that is used in combat, we find that there's increasing manifestations of anti-gender equality mobilizations through shared tactics, including rallies, colorful events, sit-ins, mobilization platforms, protests, and narratives of self-victimization that support the depiction of dissidents of gender ideology as a threatened minority, displaying also an imagery of childhood that underscores children as the paradigmatic vulnerable victim. In this lecture, however, I will focus on the different constitutional, four different constitutional, they are different, but they're often interrelated tactics, which are being displayed by this anti-gender global movement. I have identified these as constitutional entrenchment, which basically is regressive constitutional amendment, constitutional erosion, regressive constitutional interpretation, constitutional co-option, and constitutional preemption. Let me then briefly say a few words about each of them. I will draw mostly from examples from Europe and the American continent, and I will exemplify this focusing on some of the most controversial thematic areas prioritized by such movements, which are reproductive rights, gender violence, sex and gender education, good luck, Elettra, and same-sex unions or marriage. So let me start by constitutional entrenchment. And basically the idea here of constitutional entrenchment or regressive constitutional amendment is using the technique or the possibility, the mechanism of constitutional amendment with the aim of explicitly sanctioning the traditional family order in the Constitution. And probably one of the clearest example of it is the display is its display in the constitutional ban or permission to ban same-sex marriage and unions in Central and Eastern Europe, with over 8 countries, including Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Ukraine, having amended their constitutions over the last 15 years to prevent same-sex marriage. Sometimes, like in Croatia in 2013, following a national referendum campaign, which was presented to the people as a true festival of democracy in defense of the rights of children and their families. Many of these amendments have been described as anticipatory counter movements, trying to prevent same-sex marriage from being imported. And in many countries, these counter movements have counted with the support of American organizations of the Christian right, such as ADF International or Liberty Council. In terms of countries, and hence the image, I want to mention that constitutional entrenchment has proven particularly useful in Hungary, where the coming into power of Viktor Orbán's populist movement in 2010 brought about the rejection of a culturally liberal agenda embraced at the time by most of civil society, and with the support of a constitutional court, as well as the reform of school curricula, and gave the right-wing coalition government the 2/3 majority it needed to change the constitution, something which it did through a non-inclusive, non-deliberative process, a new constitution in 2011 that was followed by no less than 11 subsequent constitutional amendments in 11 years. So the new constitution, the 2011, just to give you an example of what the agenda is about, proclaims human life to be protected from the moment of conception. It defines marriage as the basis of a nation's survival and a conjugal union between a man and a woman. It provides that Hungary shall encourage the commitment to have children. And when in 2012, and partly relying on European Court of Human Rights case law, the Hungarian Constitutional Court, which at the time was still relatively independent, struck down legislation because it was endorsing a very, very narrow conception of the family, so excluding registered partnerships and same-sex unions, the majority forces just went on and responded in 2013 with another constitutional amendment that further entrenched the privileged position of the heterosexual and procreative family, while at the same time limiting the review powers of the court itself. The battle, unfortunately, has not only targeted homosexuals, but also transgender citizens. And thus, on December 2020, through the 9th Amendment to Hungary's constitution, the text has come to stipulate that in the family, a mother is a woman and the father is a man, and that the fundamental law protects a child's right to identify with their gender at birth and an upbringing based on Hungary's constitutional identity and Christian culture. And an increasingly politicized constitutional court rendered a decision in February of this year validating the prohibition of legal gender reassignment, precisely following the constitutional amendment. So don't get me wrong. I, of course, understand that constitutions can and have to be reformed to adapt to changing times, and therefore that there are procedures for constitutional amendment. However, I think we must be attentive when, while formally sticking to those procedures, we realize that behind a facade of constitutional legality dressed as reform, the foundations of liberal democracy are being undermined, as when reforms target historically discriminated against minorities and groups that only recently have been included in a more egalitarian and plural and inclusive concept of citizenship. Alarm bells should sound when the content of the proposed reform is clearly exclusionary in nature and reflects sexist, homophobic, transphobic, or xenophobic agendas, or when the constitutional reform is proposed without a prior societal debate, which includes all political forces and civil society, when a constitutional reform is used and again by an aggrandized executive to ensure that the constitution increasingly reflects the ideology of the ruling party and an increasingly narrow and sectarian definition of national identity. We should be concerned when the reform seeks to limit the powers of a constitutional court in order to bypass inclusive doctrines and precedents or escape the regulations and control of supranational mechanisms, and not even when the resort to constitutionally provided mechanisms of direct democracy, such as referenda or popular legislative initiatives, should allow us to let our guard down, because we know all too well that majorities sometimes do go for morally and ethically reprehensible options, and that executives know all too well how to selectively give voice or silence different groups in civil society. Let me now turn to the second mechanism, which I call constitutional erosion or regressive constitutional interpretation. And this is a technique which relies on constitutional interpretation rather than amendment and seeks the abolition or limitation of rights that have been previously recognized in favor of women or sexual and gender minorities, either legislative or through judicial precedents, again, relying on judicial interpretation. Maybe one of the earliest expressions, but also one of the currently most debated examples of constitutional erosion is the ongoing warfare against women's abortion rights in the United States. In fact, this constitutional warfare is quite old, given that already in the years after Roe versus Wade, pro-life advocates organized against it, including, through clinic violence. And in the 70s and 80s, many actually focused their energies on the previous tactics, the constitutional amendment, and they tried to, they went for the passage of a human life amendment that would have overturned Roe. But that didn't work out. So at the turn of the century, a more incremental strategy gained favor, aiming not to ban abortion, but to gradually erode it through increasing regulation. This regulation came to focus less on the protection of the fetus, at least from a narrative perspective, and more on the supposed protection of women from the harms of abortion and the greed of abortion providers. But in fact, it was intended to hollow out the constitutionally granted right to abortion, even without the court overturning it. It has, of course, kept the Supreme Court quite busy. The trend toward tighter restrictions on abortions accelerated dramatically in the wake of the 2010 midterm elections, which brought the Tea Party and other conservative candidates into office, for whom ending abortion was a key priority. So states all over the US began to pass more laws regulating abortion in 2011 than in any other year in American history. And supporting this legislative frenzy was the influential pro-life advocacy group Americans United for Life, which was founded in the 70s and has also supported anti-abortion struggles in many other parts of the world, including Europe. So eventually, as we all know, a Trump-packed Supreme Court has managed to overturn Roe and Casey through Dobbs, this decision that was adopted in 2018 and that upholds Mississippi state law that bans abortion after the first 15 weeks of pregnancy, that is long before the moment of viability. And under Dobbs, at least 12 states have banned abortion entirely, and there are several others where bans are in litigation in the pipeline. Now, it's interesting to note that in Dobbs, the Supreme Court argues that Roe was a bad precedent that simply made up a right to abortion that didn't exist, deriving it from a privacy notion under the substantive due process of the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. So the court says, neither the Constitution contemplated such right, nor the country's constitutional tradition protected it. And since a fundamental right does not exist in the US federal constitution, the matter would be deferred to state regulation, and therefore Mississippi go ahead. To justify the killing of the president, the Supreme Court alluded to the fact that this was not the first time. Other iconic cases in the country's constitutional history had also been dismissed. And specifically, the Supreme Court mentions Browns versus Board of Education, and the fact that it had invalidated Plessy versus Ferguson to declare educational racial segregation unconstitutional. Also, the court alluded to the nation's constitutional tradition to argue that nothing resembling a woman's right to an abortion was part of this tradition in 1868, which is when the 14th Amendment was adopted, and that in fact, at the time, most states prohibited abortion. But notice that it did not attach any relevance to the fact that the historical moment in which the ruling is set to define the contours of the relevant constitutional tradition, 1868, is one in which women did not even have the right to suffrage. In other words, with a formalism that borders on the cynical, the court curtailed women's reproductive autonomy. I would claim an autonomy that is essential for women's affirmation as full citizens on the basis of first, a precedent that served not to reinforce, but to overcome the structural discrimination, racism on which the nation was founded, and second, on a constitutional tradition that results from taking a picture of history at a moment in which women were anything but full citizens. The third tactic that I describe is constitutional co-option. And it is a tactic that also relies on constitutional interpretation and, in fact, can be put to the service of erosive purposes, but which is unique in that it specifically relies on a fundamental misappropriation, as Grania de Búrca would say, of the constitutional rights discourse, as happens when the discourse is used to protect majority values rather than vulnerable or disenfranchised groups. So constitutional co-option results from a combination of two things. First, a subversion of the logic of fundamental rights. And second, a superordination of religious or ideological freedom. In essence, the strategy consists on seeking constitutional accommodation of far-reaching conscience protections through exemptions, whether legally articulated or judicially fought for, which can significantly, if granted these exemptions, erode the rights that women and sexual minorities have been conquering over the last decades. In recent years, this tactic is seeing the light of day through legislation seeking the banning of gender and sexuality education at school or from academic curricula on the basis of alleged ideological indoctrination. Legislation which has been constitutionally contested both in Latin America and countries like Brazil and Europe in countries like Romania. Yet it is probably the spread of conscientious objections claims that best epitomizes this global phenomenon. In particular, conscientious objections on abortion rights have increasingly been sought in countries like the UK, Chile, or Colombia as complicity-based objections, so not only for doctors and nurses directly involved in the procedure, but also for those indirectly and remotely involved, such as nurses offering post-procedure care to patients or doctors referring patients for abortion. These claims are also asserted in countries like the US or Spain, where selling and insurance coverage of contraception methods, including emergency contraception, have become subject of litigation. Conscientious objections have also become a primary mode of objection to LGBT rights in countries like the UK and the US, and have been displayed primarily to object same-sex marriage and LGBT anti-discrimination legislation. And what I want to say here is that, of course, rights can be interpreted in different ways. Not only that, rights lend themselves to different interpretations because they are open nature and they contain, tensions and conflicts inside the right system. But yet again, we have ample reason to suspect that there is subversion and not affirmation of the regular democratic constitutional order when the interpretation of the constitutional text comes from courts that are not independent and have been co-opted by executives who champion the anti-gender agenda, or when such interpretations systematically or selectively prioritize an interpretive originalism that goes back to moments in the country's constitutional history in which women and sexual minorities were not considered equal citizens, or when a hierarchy between rights is proposed which lacks any constitutional basis and which allows, in the name of religious or ideological freedom, or for that matter, life from conception, the imposition of the religious convictions of a social majority as part of a re-traditionalization exercise at the expense of women and gender dissidents' equality and autonomy. And finally, let me discuss briefly constitutional preemption. And what you see is an image of a manifestation in Zagreb in 2018 against the Istanbul Convention. So this tactic, what I call constitutional preemption, consists in asserting the prevalence of national constitutional sovereignty or supremacy in order to safeguard the traditional family, and often presented as a matter of constitutional identity to circumvent international standards for the protection of women and LGBT groups. The tactic of constitutional preemption is probably best exemplified with debates around the constitutional validity of the Istanbul Convention. As you know, the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence in Central and Eastern Europe. The tactic consists on claiming that there is a contradiction between the Istanbul Convention and the national constitution, and that the latter must prevail. This trend has led to non-ratification in some countries, such as Bulgaria or Hungary, and even to backtracking in countries which had already ratified the convention and now feel that they must rectify, as exemplified by Turkey's unilateral withdrawal by President Erdogan via governmental decree, a governmental decree of very doubtful constitutionality on the basis that the convention undermines the virtuous Muslim family. Or Poland, where in July of 2020, the Polish prime minister brought a petition before the Constitutional Court to review the compatibility of a convention with the Polish constitution, arguing that the convention violates the rights of family to educate their children according to their moral and religious convictions, in addition to violating the principle of legal certainty, as there is no equivalent term to gender in the Slavic languages. Now, many of the common features of conservative opposition to gender violence legislation in general, and to Istanbul Convention in particular, do in fact include several claims of constitutional dimension. For instance, they refer to interference with family privacy, or to sex-based discrimination against men who are said to be victims of domestic violence just as often as women are, or to the various due process rights of male defendants that might be undermined. However, the most curious thing about the case is that the rejection of the Istanbul Convention has become popular as around something much more abstract, which is that the convention would make official in the country the gender ideology to the detriment of constitutionally enshrined traditional family values. The convention, in brief, is presented as a kind of Trojan horse that would impose and import evils such as homosexual marriage and gender self-determination. And so to this end, much of the criticism against the convention, as you know, has focused on the definition of gender as a social construct that the convention contains in its Article 3C. And to exemplify, let me mention the case of Bulgaria, where a constitutional decision was adopted in July of 2018. 8 judges in the Constitutional Court, there were 4 dissenting, held that the convention indeed contradicted Bulgaria's constitution on the basis, among other, that the social understanding of the concept of gender is not compatible with a constitutional reference to the protection of women and mothers before and after birth that the Bulgarian constitution contains. Basically, that the convention would ultimately erase the sexes and hence go against the binary and biological construction of sex that is entrenched in the Bulgarian constitution. And this construction, the court has reaffirmed in a later case in 2021. Similar arguments have been displayed in Hungary and Slovenia. Once again, this suggests that we must pay attention to the misuse that anti-gender actors can make of the argument of constitutional national sovereignty when questioning supranational norms that have been timidly advancing the protection of rights of women and sexual minorities. Again, it is not a matter of ignoring that the supranational system for the protection of human rights leaves states margins of appreciation in defense of considerations that have included constitutional identity, culture, or religious pluralism, nor that it is common to expect that states, when assuming international obligations, do so without violating constitutional parameters, especially as regards the minimum threshold of protection of fundamental rights, which national constitutions rightly establish. But we must be attentive when we see a government misusing the margin of appreciation that the supranational system grants to member states to discriminate or marginalize a part of its population. We must be attentive when the binding nature of supranational norms is simply ignored, or when a treaty is denounced without attending to the proper legal procedures or without a duly deliberative process, or when supranational norms are attributed interpretations, as in the case of the Istanbul Conventions, that clearly deviate from the literal tenor, or in any case, from the interpretations offered by the bodies to which the system grants the prerogative of authentic interpretation. So let me conclude. I think at this point, it is time to ask ourselves the reasons that explain such a widespread recourse to constitutional language and mechanisms by anti-gender actors. And although the answer surely requires adaptation to each of the contexts and countries, from what we have seen so far, I think we can draw some preliminary conclusions. First, we see that the legal constitutional language is offering a secular language that allows avoiding the traditional opposition between religious and the secular when articulating conservative proposals in increasingly secularized societies, and therefore that it is allowing the forging of alliances between religious sectors and populist political forces that lack prima facie a religious profile. Of course, for populist nationalists, it is also of special interest that the constitutional discipline has always lent itself not only to a debate around fundamental rights and the rules of the democratic game, but also to one about the hierarchy of norms in the legal structure and about the constitutional identity of a nation, since this allows the deployment of sectarian and exclusionary readings of the Constitution under the appearance of legitimacy, while justifying the deviation from previously assumed standards of legitimacy, be they national or supranational. To be fully honest with you, I don't think it helps either when it comes to combating this exercise of constitutional retraditionalization that the paradigmatic constitutional standards in our liberal democracies have been so modest in terms of gender and have served for a long time more to accommodate than to subvert the traditional gender order. For the truth is that, unfortunately, beyond the principle of equality and non-discrimination based on sex and some other circumstances, and maybe some other sporadic mentions of equality in certain domains, employment, marriage, most of the constitutions of liberal democracies today lack a more clear and articulated commitment to an egalitarian gender order as the one which could be articulated around several elements, including, for instance, the recognition of parity democracy as the new legitimacy standard, reproductive rights, the right to gender identity, the free development of one's sexual and emotional life, or the right to a life free of all forms of violence. Advances in the rights of women and sexual and gender minorities have been timidly and progressively affirmed fundamentally thanks to an increasingly inclusive interpretation of the concept of democracy and fundamental rights. But it is this interpretation that is now being called into question by those proposing alternative and regressive interpretations that would put an end to the universalist and emancipatory evolution that we have been witnessing. Finally, none of this exempts us from considering what may be some of the deep causes underlying the popular support that feeds the neoconservative wave, the far-reaching movements, and their illiberal and anti-gender equality agenda. If, in some scenarios, it is possible that these cultural wars and their elevation to the level of constitutional politics, so politics with a capital P, allow the creation of smokescreen to advance other agendas with a lower profile in the field of ordinary politics, P with a lowercase p. In other cases, it seems that it is precisely the adoption in ordinary politics that continues to ensure popular support for certain illiberal governments and their anti-gender equality agenda. Specifically, in many of the contexts that we have analyzed, such as Turkey, Hungary, and Poland, anti-gender equality leaders seem to nourish their nationalist populism with promises and measures providing, however selectively, support that mothers and families need. So, if we want to address the phenomenon from its root, I think it is time to frankly recognize that modern constitutionalism did not complete the task of crafting an egalitarian gender order, but rather surreptitiously settled on the economic and reproductive function of the family and based on it on the sexual division of spheres that depoliticize the reproduction of the species and the care on which it depends. And this is now facilitating a constitutional agenda that seeks to make explicit what was left implicit, ignoring the advances hard won, but those who, as women and sexual minorities, were left outside of the original social contract as an antidote to a feeling, increasingly widespread, of discontent and disorientation. And in this sense, it is also time to recognize the anxiety that is accompanying the human dislocation caused by globalization and the neoliberal economic and financial logic that sees no limit to the forms of human commodification, undermining or preventing the development of strong welfare states and generating increasing and racialized levels of inequality. We must similarly recognize the feeling of vulnerability caused by a dizzying digital revolution, which inevitably leaves many behind, and existential threats of the magnitude of irreversible environmental degradation and a pandemic. For it is precisely this complex reality and this sense of disorientation, anxiety, and fear that makes up the scenario in which the chimera of foundational social structures that should be recovered is being sold. A chimera that invites us to turn our gaze to the past and promises to come to the rescue of naked humanity by recovering the shelter and sense of belonging that the traditional family and national identity supposedly once offered. Thank you so very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ruth. And now we can start with the first panel. We'll have the European Commission Project Officer this afternoon at 3:30 before the beginning of the panel in the afternoon. Now, Angioletta Sperti, please.
Good morning. So we start now with the first panel. And although populism has been extensively studied along political, economic, and ideological lines, the dimension of relationship with gender issues remains largely unexplored. And often definitions of populism put into the background the issues concerning the symbolism or the substantive elements related to gender discourse. The weaker interest in these traits of research of populism is accompanied by the difficulties deriving from a large difference between the various contexts. And is populism always gendered or detrimental to democracy, as it is being argued? Or in some countries, populist politics has been associated with the expansion of political rights for women. So this is the first issue. At the same time, does the dichotomous approach, the moral distinction between the pure people and the elite, makes gender a non-essential component for the construction of its ideology? Or conversely, is there a specific gender dimension which is inherent to populist politics? So the scholars we have here today, and which I would like to thank for accepting our invitation, will address this issue, will provide an answer to these questions, and will also give us a general framework on populism, nationalism, and human rights. So I give the floor in the first place to Giuseppe Martinico, who is a full professor of comparative public law at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, for his presentation entitled In the Mind of the Illiberal, Human Rights as a Dispositif of Depoliticization.
Thanks indeed, Angioletta. Hello, everyone. Thanks indeed to Elettra and to the EUWONDER team for this very kind invitation. I'm a huge fan of the project. I've been following your activities on social media platforms, so this invitation means a lot to me. So thanks so much. I'm very happy to be here and to see so many friends after the pandemic also. I mean, and I have a PowerPoint presentation. Let's see if I manage to upload the slides I prepared for your eyes only. Let's see. Ta-da. All right. So thanks indeed. Should I use this one? All right, great. Okay. So in my talk, I'm gonna explore the relationship between illiberalism and human rights in the light of what scholars have called legal resentment. So we see, contrary to what is often asserted in the literature, human rights and constitutionalism have been attacked not only by right-wing illiberalism, but also by left-wing forms of illiberalism. And this is an area which has been neglected so far, and I would like to explore it with you. So after all, as we know, the revival of Cash Smith's theories has not been monopolized by right-wing thinkers only. But before getting into the juicy part of my presentation, I should define what I mean by illiberalism, and then I will identify some elements that can be traced back to what I call the constitutional counter-narrative of the liberals. Finally, building upon this deflection, I will focus on the role of rights. All right. For the purpose of this talk, illiberalism refers to a context that is gradually moving away from the protection of liberal values. So illiberalism refers to a phase of constitutional and political transition. That's why I accept the distinction made by some scholars, for instance, Neil Walker, between illiberalism and anti-liberalism. Illiberalism would refer to a context in which liberal values are treated as secondary goods. Hungary and Poland can certainly be seen as having undergone such a transition and can therefore be defined as a liberal, while a country like China, which has never experienced liberalism, should be defined as an example of an anti-liberal regime. In this, again, Kashmir is crucial. Although he was not a fan of the Weimar Constitution, to a certain extent, he tolerated the second part of the Weimar Constitution, the second part devoted to rights. Indeed, there's a Dietzenhaus put it that for Kashmir, I'm quoting Dietzenhaus, liberal rights were to be respected as the German people had chosen to create a liberal constitution, but only on the condition that public order and security had been secured. In other words, for Kashmir as well, rights were seen as a secondary good since they were subject to the, of course, state of exception. So this means that they had to be respected since they were in the constitution, but they were subject to the, of course, I mean, sovereign power of the actors who decide on the state of exception. Now, having clarified that, let me move to the next slide. This whole theoretical debate, however, reveals that liberalism is a very fuzzy concept that probably cannot be defined in an autonomous manner, in the sense that it depends on what we mean by liberalism. What kind of liberalism do we have in mind when talking about illiberalism? Are we referring to political liberalism? Are we referring to cultural liberalism and economic liberalism? So when looking at this literature, it is clear that different concepts of liberalism are being lumped together, and probably the only common ground these different views has is liberalism as individualism. Indeed, to find the confirmation of that, I think that we should look at a passage taken from a very famous speech that Viktor Orban gave, indeed, in which you can find a confirmation of this anti-individualist flavor of his communitarism, which is frequently combined with, of course, the instrumentalization of the religious and moral arguments. It's another very important passage. So the Hungarian nation is not a simple sum of individuals, but a community. And we are building a liberal state, a non-liberal state. So then we will see how this anti-individualism is combined with the conservative argument of the tradition. And these are some features that we can find in liberal regimes and that characterize their constitutional counter-narrative. What do I mean by that? They refer to the instrumental, cherry-picking, and abusive use of categories of constitutional theory and instruments of constitutional law. Indeed, the supporters of liberalism are very much interested in constitutional law, even though this might seem counterintuitive. Why? Because they are interested in making constitutional law a part of their political strategy. And Professor Marín just mentioned some very interesting examples. Constitutional law in this context becomes a tool to petrify the image of the enemy, according to a dynamical weaponization or militarization of constitutional law. And this occurs through the instrumentalization of the moral, religious, and historical argument, as said. So in this context, the Constitution becomes, above all, an instrument of government that inevitably loses its counter-majoritarian flavor. Rights, and this brings us again to anti-individualism, are perceived as factors of fragmentation. which undermine solidarity and community values. And this is the construction is of course based on a sort of organicistic reading of the concept of the people. If you want to find an example, a manifesto, we will say, of this kind of illiberal constitutional law, a very good example is given by the 2016 judgment on the Hungarian the Constitutional Court on asylum seekers. There you can see how the court used the argument of constitutional identity combined with that of sovereignty. Identity and sovereignty in the rhetoric of the Hungarian Constitutional Court are seen as a twin concept. And these arguments have been used to justify the non-compliance of Hungary with the values of Article 2 and the fundamental principles of Article 6. So this is a ruling that responds to a very static notion of identity as a sameness, and it also mirrors the Schmittian approach, I mean, that tends to reduce democracy to the majority rule by neglecting inevitably pluralism and the protection of minorities. Now, a striking example of this trend of weaponization of constitutional law is provided by some norms enshrined in the Russian and Hungarian fundamental charters. Let's start with the Russian example, Article 67, as amended in 2020. The Russian Federation honors the memory of defenders of the fatherlands, provides protection of the historical truth. I want to stress this, historical truth. Diminution of the heroic deed of the people defending the fatherland is precluded. This reminds us of this very interesting book by Nicholas Werth, Putin, historian and chef. I don't know what happened. And this book, which describes a fight for the monopoly of the public use of history, I mean, as a part of Putin's political strategy. Another interesting example is offered by the Hungarian fundamental basic law, article letter R.4, according to which the protection of the constitutional identity and Christian culture of Hungary shall be an obligation of every organ of the state. So here we can see the instrumentalization of the historical, moral, and religious argument. Now, again, this background, we can now move to the last part of my talk. Scholars have already explored the relationship between illiberalism and human rights, pointing out especially in conservative illiberalisms, the militarization of constitutional law has had a huge impact on the rights of free speech, right of religion, right to want somebody. See the contribution by Mancini, Palazzo, and Frick, for instance, it's included in the Routledge and book of Illiberalism. Again, the confirmation of this combination of communitarism and religion can be found in again the speeches given by Orban. For instance, the speech given into 2019 includes some very interesting and problematic passages. I want to quote a very long passage in which he directly attacked liberal democracy. He said that the liberal democracy was viable up until the point when it departed from its Christian foundations. For as long as it protected personal liberty and property, it had a beneficial effect on humanity. But the content of liberal democracy changed radically when it began to break the bonds that bind people to real life. So this is I would say, a strong confirmation of this dose of communitarism combined with the instrumental argument of the tradition. Now, from this perspective, liberalism is seen as undermining traditional values, and the EU is seen as a part of this threat and of this the conspiracy script, I would say. But this reflection, however, leaves out attacks on human rights that come from left-wing forms of illiberalism. I'm thinking of those reflections that see human rights as projections of neoliberal power structures, which must be challenged. Now, although I like the anti-universalist and anti-colonial flavor of this argument, I think that this view, I mean, sometimes risk forgetting the subversive potential that human rights have traditionally had in their function of contesting power structure. So in this, the legal history of the civil rights movement, I think is a powerful antidote to this way of representing rights. But what do left-wing and right-wing forms of illiberalism have in common? They share what scholars call a legal resentment. Indeed, to answer the question of how both left and right-wing liberalism conceive of human rights, we must introduce this concept, legal resentment, that is an ideal bridge, I mean, connecting these two forms of illiberalism. It refers to how illiberals approach legality, how they see the Constitution, for instance. As Paul Blocker said, legal resentment refers to the critique of what is perceived as an excessive form of legalism. The claim is that law and human rights are crowding out politics as well as societal tradition. So both left-wing and right-wing forms of liberalism question the role of constitutional law. Understood as a counter-majoritarian instrument this time. So in other words, human rights, whose protection is part of the normative mission of constitutionalism, would take space away from politics and would prevent politics from doing its job. So according to the liberals, the room of politics is too crowded with rights that exclude democratic decisions. Why? Because they again tend to reduce democracy to the rule of majority. So indeed, human rights, which become fundamental rights once they are protected by the Constitution, identify areas of non-negotiation. And this criticism is indeed frequently combined with their rejection of what some authors called over-constitutionalization. There is too much the constitutional law. And this impedes politicians and politics, I mean, to do their job. In this sense, rights, especially the fundamental rights, pay the price of so being accounted to the majoritarian bastion. And this assault on human rights can be seen as an emanation of a broader crisis, which is the crisis of liberal democracy. We should find new arguments, I mean, to explain, I mean, this role. I would say, instead of adopting a mere defensive approach to populism and the liberalism, but this will be stuff for another conference. So in other words, the contestation of rights as an obstacle to the political process is a part of the constitutional counter-narrative of illiberalism that challenges the distinction between ordinary and constitutional legality, and that presents constitutions as straitjackets, as obstacles to achieving the real democracy. Okay, so how do illiberal leaders attack fundamental rights? By creating a false dichotomy between democracy and constitutionalism, seen as antithetical concept. Of course, in this, according to the supporters of liberalism, there is a particular tension with the post-totalitarian constitutionalism, which has been enriched by further counter-majoritarian instruments, in primis eternity clauses, entrenchment clauses, and new and strong forms of judicial review of legislation. Antonio Negri is frequently evoked in this debate since he theorized this opposition between democracy and constitutionalism in his book Insurgencies, Constituent Power and the Modern State. And indeed, for liberal leaders, and for populists as well, the only acceptable form of constitutionalism is a weak version of it. In other words, a type of constitutionalism which should open up to the claims of a sort of a permanent constituent power. Of course, this idea of constituent power is then instrumentalized in order to transform the notion, Schmitt understanding of the constituent power into a vehicle for legal resentment. In this respect, that as Andrew Arato said, a populist, but also a liberal, implicitly claim that there is an absolute primacy of constituent power vis-a-vis the constitution. In other words, they understand constituent power as an instrument to mobilize the people versus the constitutional supremacy of the elite, right? So this is how they use, this concept. Now, to understand, and this is my last slide, I promise, to understand how Schmitt has also been used by left-wing critics of human rights, it is worth recalling the relationship between constitutionalism and political theology. This is crucial to understand how they see rights and constitutionalism as a forms of hubris, as a challenge to political theology. Why? Because constitutionalism is seen as an attempt at finding an alternative foundation for the political power. So human rights are seen as having to do with this attempt made by constitutionalists, and the constitutionalism is described by these authors as a form of legal moral theology. What the hell is that? In order to explain this very problematic concept, we need to look at the work by some new Schmittians, in particular Nello Prederossi in his Political Theology and Law, in which indeed he defines constitutionalism as a dispositif, as a device for depoliticizing and neutralizing conflict that are seen as the art of democracy. So for these authors, a constitutionalism that dares to disregard the political theology and which tries to find an alternative foundation for the political power is seen indeed as a dispositif of depoliticization. So here Schmitt is often mixed with the Foucault in a curious chemistry, I would say. But again, this background, legal moral theology, is described in order to portray how constitutional law will be slipping more and more into moral sacralization. Why? Because it would identify areas that are seen as untouchable for the political power. But in so doing, constitutionalism is part of the conspiracy. The constitutionalism is accused of petrifying the priorities of the agenda dictated by the powers of globalization. So the alleged universalism of constitutionalism, combined with its low political intensity, would turn out to be profoundly unjust, and that's why they reject a thick version of constitutionalism. But in my view, constitutionalism must be thick if we want to preserve its normative character. So if we want to really guarantee that it can manage, it can really succeed in its mission of not only limiting but also shaping the political power. This is what the Constitution is, according to Llorente. The Constitution is the shape of power. So thanks indeed. I hope I have contributed to reflecting on the dangers coming from both forms of liberalism, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giuseppe, for your insightful remarks on the conflation of populism, liberalism, nationalism. Now we have a tight schedule, and I give the floor to Gronia de Búrca for her presentation entitled The Reshaping of Human Rights by the Liberal Right.
Great, thank you very much. And again, thanks for the invitation to be here. It's been really interesting so far, and it's great to be in conversation with so many people who are working on these issues. As Giuseppe was speaking, I was wondering, do I disagree with him? And, you know, will I need to sharpen that disagreement? But actually, as I'm reflecting on it, I don't think we do disagree that much, although it might sound from what I'm saying as if we do. So let me explain. I am suggesting that illiberal actors around the world at present are not rejecting human rights, are not rejecting the discourse, language, instruments of human rights, are seizing them and the legitimacy that they've acquired and the social appeal they have, and are trying to reshape them or instrumentalizing them. You know, Ruth talked about subverting them, and that's a dimension of it too. So actually, there isn't the kind of, what would you call it, friction between our papers that it might seem from the way in which Giuseppe presented it. I think he's right that the discourse of the populists does pick on a cluster of rights and dismiss them as undermining of the family and so on. And it's trying to elevate a cluster of other rights. I think it's what I want to emphasize, I guess, is the interesting fact that the new populist liberals, unlike the old authoritarians, are not rejecting rights completely. And in fact, the old authoritarians, I'm going to say a little bit about what Giuseppe calls the anti-liberals in China in particular, are also embracing the language of human rights and reshaping in a slightly different way. So I want to do those two things. It's a lot to do in 20 minutes, but to sort of say that actually the new illiberals, as I'll call the populists, you know, who are everywhere, and not just, you know, Orban is a great exemplar, but they're everywhere here in Italy, in Brazil, in India, in France, in all over the world. There's interesting parallel movements of populist political forces that are doing very similar, different, but very similar things. And my argument is that they are taking on the language, instruments, norms, and to some extent institutions of rights, and using them to reshape them in an illiberal direction. And that's the paradox. How can rights be illiberal? But bear with me. So the other thing I wanted to say about, I like Giuseppe's sort of counter positioning in a way of anti-liberalism and illiberalism. For my purposes, though, the overlap, which is enormous, because I have my own definitions. I won't go into them because I don't want to confuse people too much. But anti-liberals are illiberal. Illiberals aren't necessarily anti-liberal. So there's a very big overlap. And the what they're against is, as Jeppe says, this particular notion of not just individualism, I would say universal as well, individualism, the idea of universal equal human dignity. So let me briefly, so that's just to try and position what I'm saying in relation to Giuseppe's paper, because I think though they sound different, they actually overlap a lot. So one of the key themes of the conference is the way gender has been a major focus and a preoccupation in the eruption and spread today of authoritarian populism. And Ruth has described that in part, how authoritarians and right-wing populists are challenging what they call gender ideology, and they're working hard to reverse a lot of the achievements of gender equality, of reproductive freedom, of LGBTQ plus rights, of children's rights, and various other clusters of progressive policy change. And they're pressing for a return to traditional gender roles and advancing a very strongly patriarchal agenda, even when, like in Italy, there are women, and like in France with Le Pen, women in the lead. It's a very patriarchal agenda. So what I'm trying to focus on then in my comments is the way in which this new era of populist illiberalism, I might also call it populist authoritarianism, and I'll say in a minute why, but it doesn't appear as a fully fledged rejection of human rights, in a sense of rejection of the language, ideas, and so on of human rights. Human rights being very closely linked to liberalism, the idea of respect for the dignity of individuals and the fundamental human equality of all. One might think, and that's some of what Giuseppe presented, that, you know, authoritarians, illiberals would challenge human rights. Their values are order, security, control, hierarchy, the collective, not the individual, the state, not the cosmopolitan polity, and so on. So we would expect authoritarian and illiberalism to reject rights, and yet that's not what's happening. What I think we're seeing is, rather than a rejection of the language of rights in favor of security, control and so on, social cohesion or something else. There's a move to kind of seize the institutions, use the language, and as Ruth mentioned, what I call the misappropriation of the language and concepts of human rights. So in the same way that, you know, Orban claims he's not rejecting democracy, he's creating a new illiberal democracy. You know, I'm asking, my argument is, well, they seem to be trying to create a corpus of illiberal human rights. And that's a very neat oxymoron for us, but yet there it is. The illiberals are shaping a body of human rights. So what is that and what does it look like? Before I get to what exactly it looks like, I want to just say that there are two things I think that are a bit different about the new populist illiberals. One that I've already mentioned, which is that they're not rejecting outright the language of rights, unlike, say, China in an earlier era, you know, was really against the human rights project. So that's one difference. They're not turning, and I think they've learned maybe there's something about the legitimacy and the purchase of human rights that's worth holding on to and misappropriating and so on. But the other is there are these strong alliances with religious actors and institutions. So that's, Ruth also mentioned that in her talk, a very, very strong dimension of the new populist illiberals is deep alliances between political and religious actors, very different to the authoritarian illiberalism of old, where the political dominated the religious, crushed it, silenced it, the fascists vis-a-vis the Catholics, China vis-a-vis organized religion, and so on. So we see, so these are two differences, a seizing and using of the language of rights on the one hand, and alliances, deep alliances with religious forces on the other. And that's you know, both of those are populist elements actually, because it turns out that rights are popular. People like rights. They like their rights in particular. And secondly, religion still has a strong sort of social embeddedness in many parts of the world in many respects. And so the populists are learning from this. And so you might think, well, okay, political actors, they're very, what's the word, opportunistic and instrument. Of course, they'll turn to the language of rights or constitutions or anything that might work to advance their power and their agenda. But what about religion? You know, religious, you know, institutions and actors tend to be more deeply ideological, a bit less, you know, instrumental and so on. But actually, it turns out, you know, even some of these very conservative religions are also engaging fully with rights, with human rights. So there's a really interesting book by Christina Sokol on the way the Russian Orthodox Church has, you know, turned itself into a norm entrepreneur and is engaging with the Council of Europe, getting in there and trying to influence, not rejecting and standing against and opposing and challenging, but rather getting in and influencing concepts of rights, you know, duties, family rights, you know, marginalizing certain rights and engaging in supporting amicus curiae before the ECHR in relevant cases and so on. Lawyers associations, Catholic lawyers associations in Brazil, very actively moving from anti-rights to human rights around challenging reproductive freedoms and rights and so on. So they're big shift, and the same in the US as Ruth was describing. The religious actors are learning that human rights is a useful language too. So these alliances are actually turning to use the language, the norms, the institutions of rights. I was going to then, I had a section where I was going to give my definitions of authoritarianism, illiberalism, and populism. I won't really with that, except to say that, you know, just because I don't want to confuse things, but certainly for me, what authoritarianism is mostly about centralization of control, getting rid of checks and balances, getting rid of countervailing political forces. So authoritarianism is about concentrating power and rejecting accountability. Illiberalism is more about challenging the presuppositions or assumptions of universal equal respect for all human beings and the equal human dignity of all. Illiberalism is, you know, as I'm going to say in the current era, not entirely rejecting the language of rights, but certainly very much against many manifestations of individual rights and favoring political authority over individual freedom. And populism, again, I use Jan Werner Muller's idea of, you know, the idea of speaking in the name of the real people, the authentic people, and the people somehow, and this Rousseauian, as Giuseppe said, sense of some kind of authoritarian leaders or populist leaders speak for these people directly, need no intermediating institutions, need no countervailing checks or anything, but will speak and act for the people and so on. So it's drawing on this idea of the society behind the polity. And so the social embeddedness of religion and rights and all those are drawn on by populist actors to shore up their authority and support. Okay, so the two features then that I'm pointing out are, the distinctively populist dimension of modern illiberals, our current era anyway of illiberals, is the ways in which they're using human rights rather than rejecting it. And secondly, the way they're building alliances with religious actors rather than dominating them. So these really are, alliances. And so I said, well, what are the features of the new corpus of illiberal rights? And some of this overlaps with some of what Ruth was describing, but in the particular context of gender constitutionalism. So here are some. I'll give you 4, maybe there's 5 before anyway, elements, which is how, this is how the new populist illiberals are using rights. So first, what they're reshaping the body of international human rights, not rejecting it, talking about it, going to the institutions, populating them, capturing them, and so on, and reinterpreting them. So first, they try to give clear priority to a specific cluster of rights, and they're not the usual. There are always hierarchies within human rights, in fact, torture and the use Kogan's ideas and so on. But this is a new kind of priority. So the rights of the family are very high up. Religious rights are core. Religious freedom, freedom of conscience, the right to life of the fetus in particular. And some actually, interestingly, property rights. And if you want to see, a good practical example of this, the United States, which is one of the jurisdictions in which there's been a big move on the part of the illiberal right to capture the language of rights. Under the former Trump administration, Pompeo set up a commission on, very odd name, unalienable, not inalienable, unalienable rights. And if you look at the list of rights there, it gives you a very good flavor of the hierarchy, the new hierarchy of human rights. And they are, as Ruth described, both through this funding network, but also a kind of religious alliances across the globe, really influencing the reshaping of rights in other places where illiberal populist actors are in the ascendancy. So that's the first thing, clear priority to certain, so a new hierarchy of rights. The second is actually, and this is where the illiberal dimension of human rights comes in, clear exclusions of certain persons and groups from the corpus of rights. So what liberal human rights is premised on is universality, everyone, all persons, equal human dignity for all, with a commitment then to the fact that it's always going to be developing and potentially expanding as new rights are asserted and come into fore, new forms of oppression and marginalization and so on. Whereas this is really very much, it's a conservative, illiberal reshaping of rights. So who's excluded? Well, migrants and refugees are out, not part of the corpus of human rights. Trans persons are out, not part of the corpus. So that's a new dimension. So it's not just hierarchy, but certain exclusions, and they're explicit. The third is a kind of reversal, not full exclusions, but reversal of existing protections and understandings of human rights, even those that have really crystallized and taken shape and consolidated over decades since the middle of the 20th century. So pushing back, and again, Ruth gave some examples of this. They're very clear in the area of reproductive rights, in some areas of gender equality, even, violence against women. It seems incredible, but yes, that's a target, to remove protections against violence against women, but also sexual orientation discrimination, whittling down, limiting greatly those the growing sort of protections. And then maybe the last, so those are 3 elements. The fourth, and this I think is interesting, and it's has a lot in common with classic authoritarianism, because some of these others don't, but this does. It's the dismissal and rejection of external accountability mechanisms. So no first of all, no international institutions speaking to and ruling on, or daring to say and to hold to account. But even internal, because they're rejecting internal checks and balances as well. So it's again the populist idea: we say what the rights are, we say are they being protected, we speak for the people we protect, and there's no alternative, no external accountability, really no kind of independent scrutiny of any kind at all. And that's an explicit part, and it's rejected not as we don't want anyone scrutinizing, but it's anti-elitism, national sovereignty, anti-expertise. Those are the kind of rationales given. So, I don't want to go on too much longer, but I want to, just before I finish, I want to contrast that this corpus of modern populist, illiberal actors, religious and political coalitions reshaping human rights in the ways I've described, with another current illiberal actor that's reshaping human rights. And I've already talked about it, what Giuseppe would call anti-liberal. I would see it in a bit more nuanced way. There's much more in common nowadays between China's version of authoritarianism and some of these, but there are also some interesting differences, and I want to point to them. And that is that China has moved also from a kind of a more outright rejection of human rights to a more explicit offering its own account. It does this every year with it seeking to get a resolution before the Human Rights Council, presenting the distinctive Chinese version of human rights, which looks a bit different actually from the populists' redefinition of human rights, though it has some things interestingly in common. So the Chinese approach has most strongly in common the rejection of external accountability. That's a core plank. No one, sovereignty first, no one tells us what we're doing, we're not doing, so no international accountability. And one of their ways of ensuring that is they're increasingly populating the international institutions with Chinese actors, the UN institutions. Even for the first time ever, China's begun nominating large numbers of its nationals to special rapporteur positions. These are independent human rights positions. They used to just ignore them. That was the way they dealt with them. Now it's like, no, let's take them on. Let's turn them into our conception of what a human rights monitoring actor should be. Which is not monitoring effectively. So that's one dimension. So the talk of soft cooperative approaches, prioritizing sovereignty and non-intervention, a vision of economic rights that minimizes political freedoms and sort of prioritizes economic and social rights, and then takes very strong institutional leadership in international organizations. So that looks really quite different, right? The cooperative approach is economic and social rights over civil and political rights, and then the active institutional, I won't say takeover, but reshaping the institutions rather than the norms. So we don't see a lot there, right, about gender. So what's happening in relation to gender? Well, two things. One is that there isn't the alliance with religious organizations, right? So that influence, you might say, the pernicious anti-gender influence of religion is much less present. However, from having been, and Ruth mentioned, the Beijing conference, and we always associate modern China with advancing gender equality because that was a big plank of the modern sort of Chinese move. And, to some extent, there is some truth in that still, that gender equality is still, at least, traditional gender equality is still a major part of Chinese policy. And for some years, it seemed as though LGBTQ plus rights were advancing also, slowly but advancing. Trans rights more slowly still, but still there's recognition of the right to gender reassignment for adults after surgery, etc. So it's cautious and so on, but there's some recognition there for rights. So in that sense, we might say, okay, so the authoritarian illiberal move to reshape human rights is more gender friendly. Maybe hard to say LGBTQ plus and trans friendly, but certainly it's not going into the same regression as the modern populist illiberals. However, I would say that what's happened in recent years is China has begun to kind of crack down much more firmly on any kind of civil society activism. And what that has done is sort of started to crush the LGBTQ plus movement, and many of them have been either silenced or warned to be silent. And similarly, the trans movement. So to that extent, not explicitly because of the content of those rights, but just the dangers for China of social activism and civic activism more generally has led to a real crackdown. And I think on, you know, there's a big paradox with China as well, of the being a promoter of gender equality, but a highly patriarchal political system. There are no women in political leadership. There are no women, you know, in leadership. So there's a deep paradox there, and that sort of inevitably kind of hinders or hampers the gender agenda. But still, I think those differences are really worth noting, and maybe the key one is the alliance of the new illiberal populists with religion, as being part of both what's supporting and giving sort of the social ballast and support to these movements, but also ensuring that it's a deeply regressive gender agenda, anti-LGBT, anti-trans, anti-women. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Goronia, for your very incisive and very interesting remarks on how the dominant populist parties frame constitutional rights. So now we have a short pause, a coffee break. So it will last 15 minutes. And please, I would like to ask you to sign. There is a paper that will be there. So please, all of you should sign on those papers, because the who is full professor at the University of Caen, and he will address instead the feminine visions of historical populism, because despite the fact that the stereotype of the strong man dominates the public perception of populism, we don't have to forget that there are many examples of female populist leaders who are often self-made leaders and who have built their political careers alone. So he will address their perspective. His presentation is entitled Vera Figner, Mary Elizabeth Lease and Eva Peron, Three Feminine Visions of Historical Populism. Your floor.
Thank you, Angioletta. I'd like to thank you for this wonderful invitation to meet you and return to my native country. As you say, I'm not from law studies, but from political and historical sociology, and I'm really glad to discover these wonderful realizations of the EUWONDER project. When we think about gender and populism, we usually think about current populism, the rise of the nativist and the ultra-conservative far right, and the backlash against the rights of women and sexual minorities. It is this framing which is central to this conference, which looks at the constitutional degradation produced by far-right governments in power. Their populist dimension stems from the fact that they claim a legitimacy derived from the people conceived as an organic entity. In this lecture, I propose, as I've been doing for the last 15 years in my research on populism, another perspective, which comes from the increasing stretching of the concept of populism, which is applied indistinctly to the far right and the far left, which is for me very problematic, because I consider in a sociological perspective that there are more differences than similarities between far right and left-wing populism. Given this increasing stretching of the concept, I propose to leave aside our current situation and jump back into the past, to look at the founding experiences of populism. In other terms, those experiences in which the term populism was invented to give meaning to a certain modality of political action. We are talking about the Russian Narodnichezvo, which means literally the Democrats or the Friends of the People, the American People's Party, and the Latin American populists. These experiences are so far removed from today's so-called populism that the term itself becomes extremely problematic for describing far-right governments and should perhaps be abandoned, which I propose, in favor of historically more convincing terms such as nativism or post-fascism. And in this term, there are astonishing similarities between the purposes of Orban, this definition of democracy against the individual rights and valorizing the community as a political subject, and the definition of fascism from Mussolini and Gentile. We don't have to forget this. In these three founding moments of populism, the question of gender played a certain role. In all three cases, feminist movements played an active part in the genesis of populism. Women were fully part of the democratic people that populist movements sought to build politically in order to transform their society. And in this lecture, I will present three feminist and populist women: the Russian Vera Figner, the American Mary Elizabeth Lease, and the Argentinian Eva Duarte Peron. Vera Figner came from a wealthy noble family on her mother's side, ruined by debts, and from the local ruling class on her father's side, who was a judge and a member of the local parliament. Like many of the descendants of the old Londoning families in decline, she studied medicine, then became a nurse in the countryside to promote revolutionary ideas and mobilize the peasantry against the Tsar in order to create a socialist, or what they call the populist democracy. This was the very beginning of populism in 1870s. She was one of the perpetrators of the attack on Alexander II in 1881 and spent 20 years in prison. Following her imprisonment in 1921, she wrote an autobiographical book, Memoirs of a Revolutionist, on which my lecture is based. Mary Elizabeth Lease was the daughter of Irish immigrants and became a teacher for the new schools for Osage natives in Kansas, marrying a pharmacist. She supported the poor farmers in the region and became close to the New People's Party, the first populist party in the history, founded in 1892, which was involved in a struggle against economic elites, Wall Street elites, and the political system, which supported them. Within the party, she defended women's right to vote. She then began a political career that led her to the position of state superintendent of charities in the state of Kansas, alongside her activities as a journalist and professional speaker, delivering hundreds of speeches. Two of them will form the basis of our lecture, in which she insists on the importance of the people, of women. Eva Duarte Peron was the illegitimate daughter of a Londoner and local politician in the countryside around Buenos Aires and a working class woman. On the death of her father, she migrated to the capital to make her fortune as an actress and radio voice, then an activist in the party founded by her husband, Juan Domingo Perón, the Partido Justicialista. Once Perón was elected in 1946, she became the informal director of the Labor and Social Welfare Department, where she acted as an intermediary between the workers' unions and the government. She then directed the Eva Perón's Foundation, which developed a social policy for the working classes, and the Peronist Women's Party, which obtained the right to vote for women in 1947, and then legal equality for partners in marriage, the Article 39 in 1949 Constitution, and professional social equality. She died suddenly of cancer at the age of 33, and she left a large number of speeches on which we will rely for this lecture. The Russian case is the one in which feminism assumed the most revolutionary dimensions. Here, populist women opposed patriarchy and traditional morality marked by religion, which confined women to their role as mothers and wives. These activists, Vera Zasulich, Olga Lubatovich, Elizabeth Kovalskaya, Sofia Perovskaya, Vera Figner, were mostly from the aristocracy or the rural bourgeoisie. They sometimes had family links with the Tsarist administration, like Sofia Perovskaya, whose father was the former governor of St. Petersburg. These women fought against their bourgeois education and by aspiring, first of all, to study, and often to study medicine, interpreted as a way of relieving the people of its physical and moral suffering. This was precisely the case with Vera Figner, who chose the profession of obstetrician, the only one in which women had their own autonomy and knowledge. Their struggle also involved the rejection of their social heritage, in many cases leading them to exile in Europe, as Vera, who went to live in the Fricci socialist community in Zurich. It also involved the rejection of marriage as social institution. Vera Figner's revolutionary career coincided with her divorce in 1876 at the age of 24, which is completely inconceivable in Russia in that times. Lastly, their revolutionary commitment enabled them to displace gender norms, making bombs, killing members of the ruling class, or giving orders to men were all activities that brought out, as Vera Zasulich wrote, the childhood dreams of being the equal of a boy in action and exploits. In her memoir, Vera Figner gives a definition of populist ideology. Populism, I quote her, stemmed from the fundamental idea that the Russian people, like all others, has its own philosophy, conditioned by its historical development. Hence, the need to draw inspiration from the aspirations of the people in order to formulate in revolutionary action only those demands that correspond to popular ideal. Populists need to prove to the people that the Tsar, traditionally seen as a protector, was not looking after popular interests, a program to be carried out by living among the people. The idea was to transform oneself into the people, to understand their experience directly and embody the socialist theory based on abstract ideas. This is exactly what Vera did. She became a nurse in a peasant village from where she was able to cover 12 villages in the district. And for the first time, I quote her, I came face to face with life to the countryside, alone with the people, far from my family, far from friends, far from intellectuals. I admit that I felt weak, lonely, and powerless. For someone who saw intellectual and militant life as the very condition of her emancipation as a woman, isolation must have been more difficult to support than a man. The sacrifice for the emancipation of the people was a sacrifice of herself, of what she had become as an emancipated woman. Propaganda in the countryside did not have the desired effect, and Vera joined terrorism, which was intended to create the conditions for popular mobilization by neutralizing the Tsar's repressive apparatus. In this struggle, Vera met a lot of women, in particular Sofia Perovskaya, the organizer of the Tsar assassination in 1881 and the first woman in Russian history to be sentenced to death. Vera tells the story of Sofia. Here you have the assassination of the Tsar, the center, and the death of Sofia Perovskaya. Vera tells the story of Sofia, whose path, very similar to her own, seems to embody that of all populist women. Born into a traditional aristocratic family, father had been a brutal lord, attached to his privileges, capable of outraging his mother in front of her children, and forcing even his son to offend these women of the modest gentleness typical of women in the time. Sofia Perovskaya had learned under the oppressive atmosphere of the family to love those who suffered just as she loved her mother, with whom she maintained the most affectionate relations until the very last moment. I pass to Mary Elizabeth Lease to show you another interpretation of this populist and feminist commitment. With the American populism, women's political contribution is reduced, comparing to the revolutionary dimension of this populist and feminist mobilization in the Russian case. In the People's Party, the main charismatic leaders are all men. Ignatius Donnelly, Thomas Watson, Charles McCune, William Jennings Bryan. On the other hand, in the American populism, there is a real queen, to use her nickname in that time, the great orator Mary Elizabeth Lease. She claimed that it was men's inability to do the right thing that was forcing women to enter politics. Thank God, I quote her, we women are blameless for this political muddle you men have dragged us into. Ours is a grand and holy mission to place the mothers of this nation on an equality with the fathers. It was in a 1890 speech to the Women's Christian Temperance Union that she clearly established women's role in the populist struggle. Here you have some parts of this speech. She begins her speech by establishing women's role in the populist struggle by rhetorically asking, whether she would like to live in another time than her own, to which she replies negatively, for we are living in a grand and wonderful time, a time when old ideas, traditions, and customs have broken loose from their moorings and are hopelessly adrift on the great shoreless, boundless sea of human thought, a time when the grey old world begins to dimly comprehend that there is no difference between the brain of an intelligent woman and the brain of an intelligent man, no difference between the soul power or brain power that nerved the arm of Charlotte Corday to deeds of heroic patriotism, and the soul power or brain power that swayed old John Brown behind his death, dealing barricade at Osawatomie. In this period, the mobilization of the American farmers had led to a new cooperative organization, the Farmers' Alliances, founded, she said, upon the eternal principles of truth and right, based upon the broad and philanthropic principle, injury to one is the concern of all, and exact justice to all, special privileges to none. In these organizations, the farmers and the laborers could not well exclude their mothers, wives, and daughters, the passion-burdened bearers of the home, who had been their faithful companion, their tried friends, and trusted counselors through long, weary years of poverty and toil. Hence, the doors of the Farmers' Alliance were thrown open wide to the women of the land. They were invited into full membership with all the privileges of promotion, actually recognized and treated as human beings, which is the most important thing she recognized in these new political organizations, their inclusiveness, and most of all, their capacity to understand and valorize the moral sense of justice of women, because women had the capacity to understand social justice from their real knowledge of domestic lives. And this party was the only party in United States that valorized this capacity of women to understand the social world. She insists on the women as capable to do surveys, social surveys on the country based on this moral knowledge of the world. And I pass to the last case of my study, which is Eva Peron. In Latin American populism, the proportion of female leaders is as low as in the American case. But there is one remarkable exception whose strength has feminized populism in a country more than any other political tradition. When we talked about Peronism in Argentina, there are a lot of women saying Peronism is great, is the only movement which created a recognition for women. And it's for Eva Duarte Peron, who was the wife of the main Latin American populist leaders and the embodiment of the feminist and social ambitions of Argentinian Peronism. Her first political speech on 9th October 1946 marks the anniversary of Peron's liberation on 17th October 1945. It is addressed to the women of the people, all those Argentine women who work and fight hard for their homes, to those whose adverse fortune or humble destiny has led them to the little refuge of their workshop or factory, to my sisters of the countryside, to those who need to defend something and to continue to believe in social justice for the people. She describes herself as a daughter of the people, which is true. I belong to my people. I am part of them. I am just one of you, a woman's heart who, in the difficult and painful moments of defeat, took strength from her weakness and fought for a better future for her country, for her people. I'm only a worker among you, the worker who every day sings, dreams of being closer to each of you, to those who suffer, to those who ask, to those who work hard in the daily battle for the bread of your husbands, your mothers, your children. This is the translation of this speech in the original form, which I took in the archives in Buenos Aires. And she says in this same speech, use women the same civic rights and obligations as your men. In another speech, which is 9th October 1946, the Argentinian women, this is the title, the Argentinian woman is waiting for the precious instrument of her civil claim, the right to elect and to be elected. And there is another speech, but I will only speak on the first one. She says that she wants to be called Evita, that is her name as a leader of women, the working classes, rather than just for the first lady, the woman, the Argentinian first lady. I am the wife of the president of Argentina, but the presidency passes and history ultimately does not take into account a simple conjugal bond, but the selflessness of a heart and the rightness of a conscience. If I only appeal to the fact of being the wife of General Peron to speak to you, I would feel imprisoned in the discomfort that the hierarchy and the height of a position entail. But I speak to you, I insist, as the companion Evita, companion of the first Argentinian worker. The women of my country knew well that they are listening to the art of a provincial girl educated in the rough virtue of work, which is a problem because she is really between these two political identities, the leader of the female party and the representative for social policy of Peronism and the wife of Peron. And in other parts of this speech, she says that she gives all her loyalty to Peron and Peron's position. Peron's words are something like the words of a chief, the real chief, the embodiment, the personalization of this movement. So in order to conclude, in this lecture, I have tried to show you that the aim of populism from an historical perspective is to create a new political position based on an absent subject, the people. So what might appear to be here a form of demagogy, I'm from the people, you have to call for justice. A demagogy that our politicians use and abuse today is in these historical experiences a performative modality of political discourse. Populism brings into play the rhetorical operation of making a democratic people, a demos, from the plebe, exist by calling it to constitute itself. And as Giuseppe says, it has a very close relationship with constituent popular power, which I think is not so weak as you think in comparison with other forms of constitutionalism. It's a very important similarity between all the historical experiences of populism, as in the Russian case, after killing the emperor, the populist sent a letter to the new emperor, Alexander III, calling for a national popular democratic assembly, which will restitute the sovereignty to the people. By listening to these populist women, we saw how the women's people affect the populist way, which is a very machist and virilist way of thinking about the people, by showing its promises, its incompleteness, and its ambivalence. And how what we call populism today, which refers to other forms of political action, would be understood in reference to other genetical dynamics and to other political traditions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Federico, for providing this very insightful perspective. How feminist populist leaders build their image of women, how they connect to the pure people. So now we go back to a topic that was already addressed by Ruth Rubio Marín in the beginning, in the first presentations as well. So how the advent of anti-gender coalitions has also revealed another side of constitutionalization, focusing in particular on anti-gender strategies. Now I give the floor to Silvia Suteu, who is associate professor at UCL, and she will address Central and Eastern European countries, and her presentation is entitled The Anti-Gender Constitutional Playbook. Thank you, Silvia.
Thank you very much, Angioletta. Thank you, first of all, to EUWONDER and Elettra and all the team for having me, and also just for fighting the good fight and putting together such a wonderful program, not just of research, but also teaching and dissemination of these ideas. I think that's really valuable. So I wanted to say that publicly as well. Now, as for my talk, the title is a bit broader, and if it had to have a subtitle, I think it would be something like Taking the Long View. And I think this is reflective of where we are now, not just in analyzing these anti-gender equality moves, but also now starting to take stock of their impact, and also being able to take a bit of a longitudinal view, assessing how they fit within the history of constitutional history, but also just more general history of particular regions, particular countries, etc. And starting to speculate, hopefully in an informed manner, about where they might go and what chances of resistance and success there are. So I'll start by how do I do that? Making three or suggesting three propositions to you. And again, these are reflective of, everything that has happened, not just in Europe, but elsewhere, although my talk is indeed focused more on Central and Eastern Europe. But I should say from the start, not just Poland and Hungary. I am Romanian myself, but I'm also looking at the region as a rich panoply of experiences in terms of gender equality. And I'll put it out from the beginning that it's not all bad. So we'll see what I mean by that. But here are 3 propositions that I would like to focus on in my talk. The first is to say simply that the rule of law crisis, and this is language that is very familiar to those of us working within the sort of the European Union legal landscape, the rule of law crisis was always gendered. And there was always a gender dimension to it, or a dimension focused on gender that should have been noticed much earlier, and that should have been centered in reactions to the rule of law crisis itself. So ignoring this came at great cost, as we see today. And it is something that should have been noticed in 2 ways. And I think Professor Rubio Marin's presentation really provided a wonderfully rich overview of the tactics, etc., that have been employed. But linking that to the rule of law crisis, as it's been discussed in the EU, I think what we, and I say we, but I also mean not just scholars, but also the EU itself, in reacting to this, has missed is that a lot of what went into undermining rule of law institutions, including courts and other accountability mechanisms, either was also targeting eventually gender equality advances. So it's not a coincidence, for instance, that Orban first made sure to capture the court, the Constitutional Court, and deactivate accountability mechanisms to capture the media, and then to proceed to, among other things, adopt constitutional amendments that entrenched this particularly, I don't think even traditional is the right word, but really exclusionary view of the family and gender roles. So on the one hand, you have these moves that were anticipatory, but not immediately obviously linked to gender equality, and they should have been noticed, I think, as that, or should have been anticipated. But on the other hand, I think gender equality or reactions and regressions on gender equality should have been spotted as the canary in the coal mine, right? Some moves, including, for example, anticipatory referendums to preempt the possibility of legalizing same-sex marriage, were not seen as part of the same story of undermining the rule of law, right? The rule of law is this fanciful sort of, higher level ideal, whereas these, whether you want to call it backlash or, well, anticipatory moves were seen as, yes, bad, but just not part of the same story. And I think that was a mistake. So that was the first proposition I wanted to put on the map from the get-go. The second is by now obvious, also because of what my predecessors have spoken about, the fact that the anti-gender playbook is highly sophisticated. It is based on transnational networks and transnational funding. It is well funded, and it is at times deceptive, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And the third one is that the consequences will be long-term, and by that I mean not just the immediately obvious consequences, the direct consequences of these amendments or legislation that were passed, but also consequences at the level of constitutional culture, of judicial interpretation and technique, of judicialization of politics and of public discourse. And I think that's an aspect that we need really to remember and look at seriously as well. Again, also because we have the benefit now, for good or bad, of many years of this happening. So I'll start also, keep starting, but I'll start also by taking a longer quote from the same report that Professor Rubio Marín quoted, The Tip of the Iceberg, which is an impressive document because it really looks and documents the financing of what's been going on over the period from 2009 to 2018, I believe, so a decade of, a lot of money. They put the total figure, I think, at over $700 million being poured into these campaigns, both from within the EU and outside, primarily the US and Russia. So interesting allies there, right? And this is a lowball figure, right? It's a low estimate of how much money has been spent on both the European level and at the domestic level to get these measures into place. But this quote on my slide really points to something else that we need to be aware of, and that makes analysis more complicated. And that is, and I'm quoting now, that understanding the anti-gender funding landscape in Europe leads to the conclusion that there is not one centralized objective to the movement and its funders, i.e., that the phenomenon cannot be summed up as backlash to progressive advances, but rather that several overlapping, decentralized, and mutually reinforcing projects fuel anti-gender mobilization. So it's not one enemy we're fighting, but several. And furthermore, that understanding the multiplicity of objectives that opens the door to better understanding the phenomenon and therefore how to counter it, as well as the possibility to forge new alliances. Anti-gender objectives constitute a normative project in their own right, but equally constitute a component of related political and economic projects. And these overlapping projects fall into three broad categories, and then the report goes on to detail these as a theocratic project, a hyper-capitalist economic project, and an illiberal political project. And I say this not because I have the expertise or indeed the time, even if I had it, to go into these different projects, but just to remind ourselves that we're dealing with something very sophisticated and well-funded, but also that brings together these different aspects, and that it's not just about the politics surrounding gender and the family, but also the economics of gender equality, and about, yes, religion, which has been mentioned before as well. Now, going back to my first proposition, in what way is the anti-gender playbook similar but also distinctive within the rule of law crisis and the anti-rule of law playbook? I think there is a great deal of overlap with how the rule of law has come under attack. And again, I won't be telling you much that is new here about the misuse and abuse of legal institutions and structures, including courts, accountability institutions, processes for constitutional reform, legislative change, etc. Other features they share, I think, are the cumulative and hard to pin down effects of many of these measures, right? It's not always easy to pull out the one legal reform that has led to the complete undermining of gender equality advances, but it's several different ones at different levels, adopted at different times, and with different degrees of visibility. And that makes it hard to piece together before you can even react. The abuse of international human rights law has been nicely noted by Professor Búrca, and that plays out both on the international plane, but also at the level of, at the domestic level, with domestic courts, misappropriating not just the language, but concepts and doctrines of international human rights law and turning them on their head to undermine gender equality. And of course, the transnational element, which has been mentioned already. But what about the specific gendered dimension? Again, Professor Rubio Marín has neatly laid out tactics and strategies used to restrict access to abortion, from changes in constitutional interpretation to constitutional amendment to legislative change. We also have others, of course, anti-LGBT measures, including bans on so-called propaganda, the adoption of mandates for so-called LGBT-free zones in some localities in Poland, for instance, the attempt by the Orban government to use, to adapt the EU directive on whistleblowing to prevent or to use it against the LGBT community, stopped at the last moment. The emphasis on traditional family and also measures purported to support the traditional family and pronatalist measures. And this is one example of where, the playbook is deceptive, because when you have measures such as increased financing of child support, or again, measures that are meant to encourage natality, they could be seen, and some have fallen into the trap of seeing them as welfare measures, right? Welfare policy, and making the argument that actually, this might be one of the positives of a government or regime, rather, such as Viktor Orban's. For all that he does poorly on these other things, at least he's doing this, or the Polish government itself. But I would argue that that is entirely the wrong way to read this. And when you go into the details, it's not even how it plays out on the local level. These are pronatalist measures, for instance, in the case of Hungary, that help only certain kinds of family, right, where the parents are in employment. And it turns out that they augment the wealth of the wealthier families. They don't go to the needier, and they actually undermine the social welfare system that was still in place, and the child benefits that, the poor and more disadvantaged in Hungarian society were at least still receiving. So they're deceptive also in another way, in another sense, when you look at a country that has essentially turned into a kleptocracy, where, Viktor Orban again is channeling EU funds to his buddies, and undermining the country's economy, and also failing to tax the wealthy. Is that really a welfare based society that works in favor of families? So deceptive in that sense. And then gender ideology, which again has been mentioned before. I won't go into it right now, but just the idea that there is also a normative enemy here at play, that it comes through both, both from the outside, from above, and the fight against the Istanbul Convention has become an example of that, or from below, with feminist and LGBT activists purportedly bringing this agenda and undermining traditional institutions and traditional family. So the argument here is, again, that the anti-gender constitutional playbook is deserving of close scrutiny, both on its own, but also as a core component of the rule of law crisis in the EU. And I think this, again, has been missed in part, and we've come late to this at our own cost. Now, I won't say very much about how abortion has been, and access to abortion has now been reframed in public and in part in constitutional discourse. Much of that has been said by speakers before me. What I would add here is that I see a deeply problematic reframing of this issue in constitutional discourse in Central and Eastern Europe, but not only, remaking it in the face of its American counterparts, right? This idea that it's a pro-life, pro-choice, polarized debate, which in constitutional terms leads to proportionality analysis, the balancing of the right to life against a woman's right. And once you go down that path, it's very hard to undo, and you sort of play by the rules of a game that is kind of stacked against you. And the way I see also the American saga to have played out is also to illustrate how pernicious it is not to have strong equality guarantees within the Constitution, and how the absence or weakness of the equality argument has come back, to really undo gains made through constitutional interpretation in American constitutional law. But that needn't be the way it plays out in, European countries, and certainly not in Central and Eastern European countries that actually have, strong constitutional equality guarantees and long histories of providing access to abortion. So actually this reframing goes against, autochthonous constitutionalism, but of course it's not presented as that, and it is taking over in a way that I think is really dangerous. The other thing I would add here, but maybe not go into very much for lack of time, is the aspect of access to abortion, real on-the-ground access to abortion. Now, a lot of what we've talked about today, has been at the constitutional level, the level of interpretation and discourse, etc. But sometimes, often, I would say, the changes needn't even be formal or not at the constitutional level, but they happen on the ground. And Romania is an example where, you know, the constitution is fairly rigid. It hasn't been amended. Legislation itself hasn't necessarily been amended, but what you see now is a rise in conscientious objectors and the rise of numbers of hospitals and regions where it is becoming increasingly difficult in practice to get an abortion if you need it. So the so-called abortion deserts that we see in states in the United States are now also migrating to other places where it would have been, to me at least as a Romanian, inconceivable to think of this. But for a variety of reasons, it is happening on the ground as well. So that's another alarm bell to ring, and it is that, you know, real life access to giving effect to these rights doesn't even have to change in the aftermath of constitutional change. It can happen also through these informal changes that then accumulate over time. I noted that Professor Martinico also used the word weaponizing, and I think that's, you know, it does sound like we are at war, right? Lawfare, weaponizing, you know, weapons of the anti-gender playbook, but it is true. And this is another example to add here, the weaponization of public participation. The example I've given here with a photo from a protest by essentially a fascist organization in Romania against, you know, against imagined attempts to undermine the traditional family, have to do with the use of citizens' initiatives and popular referendums in the attempt to preempt the legalization of same-sex marriage, but they, you know, it's not limited either to this topic or to this instrument. Another tactic would be what is, I think, now called astroturfing, so presenting crowdfunding as well, successful crowdfunding as evidence of popular support for certain measures, when actually what is hiding behind the great amount of money that is being raised are usually large donors with specific agendas. And another tactic that hasn't been discussed thus far, deploying so-called slaps against gender equality activists, so strategic lawsuits against public participation. And these are not a new phenomenon. And again, you find them quite extensively in the US and Canada and other places. But the idea here is that you have well-funded private actors, which sometimes include public officials acting in a private capacity, suing their political or ideological opponents. They are often deployed against media, so journalists, to silence them, but also against, in this case, gender equality activists. And one example here is of the co-founder of the All Poland Women's Strike that, you know, a couple of years ago was reporting over 90 lawsuits against her. And the idea is not necessarily to win these lawsuits, but just to intimidate and to bankrupt these individuals into silence. And of course, these types of measures also have a chilling effect on public discourse and activism. Now, let me get quickly, because I'm running out of time as well, to some observations about long-term consequences. I've already mentioned my fear that the way public and legal discourse are being framed and reframed is really concerning. This focus, for instance, in abortion debates on conflicts of rights, be they fetal or religious, rather than on equality, health, autonomy, is really pernicious. But also the abuse of other legal concepts, such as constitutional identity, which again, Professor Martinico mentioned, so I won't say more on, the judicialization of issues, and not just through entrenchment at the constitutional level, but at the sub-constitutional level. And also, and this connects to what I was just saying about slaps, the rise in litigiousness as a tactic and as a consequence of what we're seeing. Delegitimizing international law, international institutions, and international human rights law in particular, and also exposing the weakness of the EU as an actor that is capable of responding to this. And the only example I'll give in the interest of time here is the reaction of one EU commissioner to the Polish 2020 Constitutional Tribunal decision that led, that essentially, further restricted access to abortion in Poland to the point of it being nearly impossible to access abortion in the country now, saying, well, it's very bad, but the EU does not have competences in what concerns reproductive rights. And that was such a narrow way of viewing the issue. And again, a way to separate, women's rights and gender equality from the core of the rule of law crisis that I think, was misguided and actually wrong in law as well. One long-term consequence that isn't on this slide, but that I do want to maybe put up for discussion eventually, is the danger that we draw the wrong conclusions as scholars as well, looking at what has happened and maybe wanting to swing the pendulum too much in the other direction. So for instance, to think, well, constitutional rigidity, so we avoid landing in the situation of too easy amendment, right? Or anyway, it's a brief call to say we need to think really carefully about what is doing the harm here and the role of law and the role of constitutional structures. But it wouldn't be a presentation from me if I ended on a pessimistic note. So I will give a couple of reasons for optimism. I think in my view, every action causes a reaction, and the reaction we have seen in countries in Central and Eastern Europe to these attempts to undermine gender equality, are also a reason for optimism. There's been a rise in knowledge and deployment of the law. So, the activists are striking back and using lawfare themselves, including in strategic litigation, the recourse to supranational institutions. There's an example here from just this year, Búrca and others against Romania, which is a decision requiring or finding the Romanian state in violation of its convention duties for not providing any form of legal recognition to same-sex couples. And that, I hope, will pave the way eventually to moving the dial on this. And the other reason for optimism here is Slovenia's example. Now, Slovenia became last year the first post-communist country to legalize same-sex marriage. And, that's a welcome development. But I think looking at how long it took to get there and what the stages were is instructive in setting also our expectations. So Slovenia was, at the forefront among these countries anyway, because it had an LGBT rights movement already in the early 80s. It provided, limited, but some recognition to same-sex couples already in 2005 through legislation, expanded in 2016, and then finally expanded again through judicial intervention and then legislative change in 2022. They also had a couple of referendums that were led by the church and their affiliates trying to preemptively block the recognition of same-sex marriage. And the referendums were successful. But what analysts are saying is that actually what happened during those referendum campaigns was that the social distance between people in Slovenia and their LGBT brethren was narrowed. All of a sudden, there was a human face to this community and to the rights claimers. And gradually, public attitudes shifted, and obviously political and judicial attitudes shifted as well. So we ended up with legalization. A couple of images to perk us up, I think. One from 2020 or 2016, actually, even before the 2020 decision in Poland. Women coming out onto the street in droves to protect their rights, and also an image from Romania saying human, not ideology, protesting attempts to ban the teaching of gender ideology in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia, for providing such an interesting perspective, for showing us the overlap between mutually reinforcing strategies that were anti-gender project as a normative project that merges with political and economic projects. I'm glad that you find some reasons for optimism. I'm pretty worried about the rise of conscientious objection claims. I found them extremely tricky, extremely dangerous. And so I thank you. And now I think it's Silvia's topic merges very well with the topic that Veronica Federico is going to address right now. Veronica is associate professor of comparative public law at the University of Florence. She will present a paper on regulating migration at the time of populism, women as battleground in European populist migration legal framework. So she will address immigration, anti-migration claims, a staple of populist parties. Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you, Angioletta. I think we can display better the slide, because otherwise I don't think I will be able to go through them. Okay, thank you. And let me start, and I hope this will not count as my 20 minutes, to thank so much Silvia for her optimistic closure again, because I really think and I would say constitutional militantism that we all share, that sometimes we need good news. Because they really motivate us. Otherwise, I mean, it's easy when we enter this, I would say, thorny terrains to get a bit discouraged, you know, and especially in the spirit of the Jean Monnet chairs, we definitely need positive push to be supported in the teaching activities, to be supported into the dissemination stuff. So we need to build up a baseline, you know, to say, okay, let's start from here, let's discuss, but let's do not give up. And this helps us in not giving up. I skip the thanking because otherwise I will erode too much of my time. Yet, and I have a small disclaimer saying that, I mean, up until now, the whole debate has been theoretically very high. And I think I will lower the threshold. So, and I will try to see whether all these ideas that have been put on the floor, how do they deal when facing reality, when facing everyday people life, especially when those life are the life of the more vulnerable. And to try to explore, I've tried to do this without prejudice, but I can't say I've done it without prejudice. I've tried to explore the tensions that lies behind a number of, you know, universal rights discourse. And in these fields, we see that the tensions are really, really high. So, oh, sorry. Let's see. Sotto? Okay, right. Thank you, Elettra. So, when Elettra first asked me to come here in Pisa, she gave me the elements, you know, the ingredients for the recipe. And the ingredients were women, populism, migration. And we were having a coffee and I said, oh, I will never manage. And then I started digging a bit into it. And I found, and I had a first idea saying, oh, well, there could be, you know, something to say. And then the more I studied, the more I realized that there was even too much meat around the bones that I thought were there. And indeed, this meat is mainly social science meat. And so I was really trying and struggling this summer, thanks Elettra, for having, you know, accompanied me during August, to see how the analysis of the social scientist colleagues could be translated and seen under the legal perspective. And these meet around an idea is the analysis of manifest, contradiction by radical populist parties throughout all Europe, that in the name of gender equality, exactly them, that are in the field retrenching, women's right. They are attempting, as we have just heard from the previous learned exposition, that they are trying to downsizing women's rights, yet in the name of women's right, they are trying to fight against new migration inflows. How to make sense of this? And how to make sense of this in legal terms? What does it mean from a legal perspective? And there is much analysis about this, especially by those colleagues that works on discourse analysis and on, claims analysis. But very, very little, rather nothing, has been written from jurist colleagues. So what I'm going to tell you today, hopefully in a little time, is just to go very quickly through the facts, because they are quite striking. So it's interesting to have a look at them, and then to see how these facts fit into the migration law trends and the voices of populist radical right parties throughout Europe, and then what all this means for women, and then trying to some very, small conclusions. And okay, the facts. While exactly working on this, I found myself collecting pages and pages of quotation from the mid of the 90s, and Netherlands was a groundbreaker in this way, but really pages of quotation by populist radical right parties throughout Europe, claiming that migration as a danger for European society, especially because the migrants, are imposing on us, the West societies, their gender roles that are regressive gender roles. Therefore, we cannot accept the others that are mainly stereotypized, as we will see, as the Islamic migrants. They are not simply coming here to steal our jobs, but they are coming here to transform our society, a society in which, and I quote Salvini, that for me is quite a strange thing to do, is to impose their way of life in our country, where women have the same rights as men, which is something quite odd with all what we've heard up until now, isn't it? And indeed, traditionally, populist, and this is why as well I fully buy Federico's. That's why, Federico me, Federico him. On the populist, right-wing and left-wing party makes a difference in this field, definitely, at least in migration. Traditionally, right-wing populist parties have a conservative stance towards gender issues. Needless to go into this, you have already digged this quite enough. But since the mid of the 90s, the use of veils, not because of the veil, but because it's a marker of women's inferiority. The treatment of women in a number of Eastern European parties, and so on and so forth, are put forward by those voices as a threat to modern European society. And in name of this, legitimizing on the one end, the restriction of entries, on the other end, an increasing, effort in tightening and making it harder for other peoples, non-Europeans, to integrate into European societies. Indeed, it seems that migration is a field that has served those parties to recraft their position toward gender issues in a way. We will develop this a bit more in the next 5 minutes, so I'm not going too much into that, but I think that here at Merge, it comes up immediately, a very utilitaristic use of women's right. And the second element is what Sarah Faris, that was a groundbreaker and this kind of studies, what she names femo-nationalism. And she has built a whole argument that I'm not fully buying, but I would need to think about it more, to be honest. And she argues that these claims, the one that we have just seen, do not necessarily belong to the family of populist discourse, but rather of nationalist discourse. And in making this difference, she argues as well on the fact that populism usually neglects the gender dimension. And this is something that following Susanna Mancini's, for example, argument, I really do not buy. So, but it is there in the famous market of ideas. Another element that we need to add to the scene, to set up our scene, is how the radical populist right-wing parties have worked as narrative setters in the last 20-25 years in the migration field, as really narrative setters. I'm not saying that they have been, defining their political agenda, but definitely they have been very, very clever in defining and in shaping through the media the narratives that have in turn strongly influenced public opinion, and this has led to set the political agenda and the legal agenda. In a absolutely rude and unsophisticated, so please bear with me, simplified to the very bones way, but still we see that there are a number of, of consequences. No more migrants, Europe has become a fortress. Bogus asylum applicants and all Western Europe, no, all European countries, no difference East-West, have really built up legal frameworks based on immigration. So putting together criminal laws and immigration. Italian first, but we say Hungarian first, Spanish first, Polish first, and a number of growing barriers to entering the labor market, to welfare right, and so on and so forth. So definitely we have to accept the fact that even in those countries, such as, for example, Spain, where the progressive parties have been, at government and for a long period in the last years, yet the populist right-wing parties have been extremely successful in narrative setters, and as such to influence not simply the political claims, but the legal framework. They have a strong impact because they have managed to crystallize into a plethora of norms, of rules, this fortress. what does this has to do with women then? Well, because this has been a struggle which has been fought largely on women. Women have become the battleground on a number of those stands. And I've tried to, and please bear with me, I'm really at the beginning of the theoretical frame of all this. So for the time being, this typology that I'm proposing you is very gross. So it needs much. It needs to be fine-tuned and redefined. But yet, I've tried to clusterize the multiplicity of regulation that have developed and that have been adopted and that touch women into three broad categories. The first one is in the name of the protection of women, in the physical protection of women. So not women's rights, but really the physical integrity of women against the brutality of the foreigners. Let's stop them. And with a plethora, a number of regulation, diminishing the influx of migrant, both forced and non-forced. I, as a scholar, as a migration scholar, strongly challenge this differences between forced and non-forced, but this is not the place where to do it yet. They have managed to put threshold, for example, during the so-called refugee crisis, on the asylum application that could be received and processed by month, on a monthly rate, which poses a tremendous stress on the 1951 Geneva Convention and on the right of asylum, for example, exactly in the name of protecting our women. The second stream, the second cluster is a more interesting, variegated cluster, and is the one I would need to think more about. The fact that there has the law at different level, from the constitutional level, that is the one that Ruth has been talking about, to the very local level. So major ordinance, for example, have stereotypized women's position in their societies. And this has been as well stigmatizing those societies in a truly Islamophobic stance. And this has taken the form of the limitation, for example, of family reunification. Family reunification is worldwide recognized as a fundamental right in the name of a number of international, supranational, law, regional, national fundamental norms. And moreover, already at the beginning of the 50s, the Conseil Constitutionnel in France has recognized the fact that allowing foreigners to form a family would be beneficiary for l'ordre public, which is quite stressful for the French legal system. I mean, it's really something that occupies a lot, the argument of the French. And the Conseil Constitutionnel has used so much this claim of public order, l'ordre public, which is not exactly the same as public order, but still, in the name of limiting migrants' rights. Yet, at the beginning of the 50s, it has been used in order, exactly in the name of public order, to allow family reunification. Well, exactly because in Poland, for example, family reunification has been recognized simply for, okay, a time expired. Okay, sorry, yet for, yes, I'm going very fastly, for, marriages that recognize, that are based on the constitutionally recognized marriage, which is the Catholic one. Not simply same sex, but also non-Islamic ones. So a plethora of minor regulation. For example, this summer, and the same applied in France, major forbade Muslim women to go on the beach with their burkini, not allowing them. So it's a very minor source of law, majoral ordinance, but they contribute, constituting this what I name the nebula of regulation that still hit so much on people's life. The third cluster is the cluster which is in a counter, is a sort of a reversal. So while we are limiting migrants, still we are opening the channels for domestic foreign workers and caregivers that are mainly female. I skipped the process of otherness that is inherent to all this, but is very crucial, especially for jurists. We shall never, ever forget that the processes of othernessing, they construct the illusion, but still we love that illusion of the universality of rights. And we know even too well from Hannah Arendt discourse how dangerous it is to fragment, the entitlement of rights, and to what this should lead with the hierarchization of rights. To conclude that saying, is it together? Yeah, okay, that when women are reduced to become battlegrounds, when they embody the battlefield, the risk of denying the women's agency is very strong. And when laws do that, laws that should empower do that, that becomes very, very dangerous. And it is absolutely contrary to the principle of the centrality of the person, what in Italy we name il principio personalista of rights. And let me conclude with something that may sound a paradox or a rhetoric sense, but the risk is really that in the name of equality, we risk to undermine, to deny, to erode the most fragile rights. So here we are really putting our hands into a very, very delicate terrain. So I'm not claiming in any case that the subjugation of women that still exists in a number of societies should be legitimized, but that denying the right to access to Europe, to those societies, to people coming from those societies in the name of women's rights is a further, victimizations of victims. And we have to be very careful about that. I do apologize. Please, Angioletta, bear with me.
Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. I do apologize for having such a tight schedule. And so thank you very much for illustrating us the instrumental use of gender issue to fuel anti-immigrant narrative. And I presume that we can also think at those arguments as a way for populist parties to make their xenophobic positions more respectable as well. So now we switch to go. Oh, it's online. Oh, yes, we welcome our project officer that Elettra told me she is online. Okay, so welcome. And now we address the last issue, the last topic. I give the floor to Simone Penasa, who is associate professor at the University of Trento. He will address how the use of scientific technological factor by legislators and courts can represent a way to carb on populist policies. So the presentation is entitled "The Science and / Against Populism, Legal Narratives on Gender in Medicine and Scientific Research." Simone, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I never understand my title when I reread it, so I skipped it. So I'm also perfectly aware that I'm the 7th speaker today, so I'm with you, and I'm trying to be reasonably brief. So so I briefly but deeply thank Elettra for inviting me here, and she gave me more or less a similar recipe with the science at the place instead of migration. And so I tried to develop and to write this recipe down in 5 steps. And that is what I will try to do in my 20 minutes. The first step is asking why linking populism and science, in the sense that I think we need to answer the question: is there room for scientific declination of political populism, which can express some kind of originality, which distinguish it from the classical political populism. The second step is to integrate among populism and science and healthcare the variable of gender and gender-related rights, which, of course, and this has been discussed deeply during this session this morning, can be viewed as a litmus test in order to understand and assess also the compatibility of populistic rhetoric with constitutionalism. Then I try to assume maybe original perspective, asking me which can be the role of science, scientific and biological concept, and the scientific expertise in this triangle: populism, science, and gender-related rights. And I will provide you with 2 possible use that link science with populist rhetoric in this context. Science can be used as a vector for populism, and in this sense, of course, and almost inevitably, woman's body can become a target of populism. And I will say something about abortion, a very well known and already discussed cases. But science, and this is maybe the more interesting part of my presentation, can be intended, and I will provide you with some concrete example from constitutional adjudication and the statutory dimension as an embankment against the populist drift. By assuming a constitutional-oriented use or understanding of science. And then I will conclude with some brief remark, because I will not have enough time, by asking for a careful approach to labeling in order to avoid risk to the motto, everything is populism, so nothing is populism. In order to understand if there's an originality of scientific populism, the linkage between populism populist rhetoric and the scientific and medical dimension. I had a look through the literature and the scholarship, and in order to find some definition, labels, and also and especially common future. So as you can see it's not a very much developed context in referring with populism, but you see at least three possible label definitions: science-related populism, medical populism, and scientific populism. And if you go deeper into this declination, you can see some common features, which of course could assume the scientific populism as a declination of political populism, because you see recurrent are more or less the same label, the same principle, the antagonism between the people and the elite, of course, decline in terms of scientific expertise and institutional expert, the distrust in institutional science, the denigration of the role, for instance, of experts within the decision-making political processes. And at least in one definition, I see one key variable and key element, the need to detect and distinguish in an accurate way the real scientific populism from any kind of criticism or critiques against science. No, the debate or disagreement for, I don't know, research with embryos or other scientific and medical declination. So the research question could be, is scientific populism automatically against or outside the constitutional order? And if it is the path, how to measure it? Of course, we can, and we already heard some possible markers of this route. The distortion, which is something different from the breakdown or the rupture of constitutional essential, pluralism, balancing of all rights, and especially the role of constitutional adjudication, the impact of fundamental rights, of course, decline in terms of right to health, self-determination, and equality in the healthcare sector, but also the impact on scientific and medical autonomy in taking decision, in patient and physician relationship, but also in a kind of risk of politicization of science and scientific research in order to capture it for making it a kind of channel for the populistic rhetoric. And of course, a possible marker can be also to look at and to assess the scientific reliability of political choices grounded on a populistic stance and approach. So in this conceptual frame, scientific populism can be considered as a litmus test of compatibility of populist agenda with constitutionalism. Gender-related rights, I will focus on abortion, but there can be plenty of different example and context, the human-assisted reproductive techniques, for instance, or gender transition, can become a target for political populism. And I will provide you with possible twofold nature of the use or the interpretation or the selection of scientific data according as tool for, but also tool against or to limiting or to reconduce populism to constitutionalism. Of course, in my understanding, but this is also a common frame of reasoning, the reaction of constitutional safeguard, especially the role of courts, is key in order to guarantee the linkage between constitutionalism and scientific populism. So, and here you can find, and also in the medical sector, you can find this the dichotomy between, of course, as watchdog of constitutionalism and the risk, of course, constitutional courts be captured or become expression of political populism. I will briefly focus on the case of abortion, referring to Dobbs, the degradation of the deconstitutionalization of the right to abortion, and the Polish Constitutional Tribunal judgment on 2012 and 20, in which there was declared the constitutionality of the removal of the exception in the event of severe and irreversible fetal impairment. I will not describe because I'm not so full these two cases. So I just provide you some fil rouge, which can be considered as a kind of scientific populism markers. Of course, that one, which is very referred and related to the idea and then the conception, the theory of right and the balancing of rights, are very close to the way in which legitimately a constitutional court can understand the theory of the constitution, the theory of the constitutional interpretation. But of course, in these two judgments, we find a specific way of understand, which is also based on some medical or scientific ground. The denial of gender-based discrimination. No, the majority in Dobbs says or seems to say that the degradation of abortion is not an excuse for unjustifiably discriminating women, the vanishing of women's fundamental rights before the protection of fetus life, and I'm referring to the Polish reasoning, where the special assistance to a mother before and after birth provided set forth by the legislation has been interpreted as a grounding for a public duty to protect not the health care, the well-being and the autonomy of the woman, but the life of fetus, something that some Italian scholars define as ideological biologism, as the refusal of any balancing between conflicting interests and rights, which led to the degradation of women's rights and well-being. Of course, here are we moving within constitutional interpretation? Because if you look at Dobbs, but also at the Polish judgment, you see the systematic recalling of the essential of constitutionalism, the reference to constitutional interpretation. If you look at the majority and the dissenting opinion, you see like two different handbook on constitutional law and constitutional interpretation. But of course, the constitutional interpretation, a certain way to interpret the constitution is used to build on the judicial reasoning. So in a kind of, they're trying to depoliticization of the judicial assessment. You find the reference to the people, the centrality of the people. There's nothing to do the degradation of woman well-being. You make use of a certain understanding of people and popular sovereignty. The authority to regulate abortion must be returned to the people and their elected representatives. It's the majority in Dobbs. Some Polish scholars has interpreted the judgment, the 220 judgment, as an example of a delegation technique from the government and parliament to the constitutional court, the delegation of enacting a populist agenda that shifts the burden of populist politics from the government and the parliament to the constitutional courts. Very briefly, the use and the interpretation of scientific and biological concept that becomes a tool or a normative or almost normative grounds in order to build on the decision. The viability, which in Dobbs has been defined as an arbitrary line. I pass through very brief. In the Polish judgment, the qualification as eugenic assessment of the deservingness of the life of the unborn child. If you look at the statutory dimension of the parliament laws, you may refer to the Texas Heartbeat Act, where the first detection of fetal cardiac activity has been selected as the temporal limit to have access to abortion. Or another example from Hungary, the so-called heartbeat rule, where by a ministerial decree of the last year, doctors must to certify that he or she has presented the woman with a clearly identifiable indication of the fetus vital signs. Woman want to have access to abortion. Of course, here we already heard about it, we can trace back to the Constitution a formal ground. Article 2 of Fundamental Law 2011, the constitutionalization of the protection of the life of the fetus, that become a legitimate, at least formally legitimate, based on which ground the political development of the populist agenda. Of course, and this is open question for lunch, are Dobbs and the Polish Constitutional Tribunal decision an expression of political populism in the medical context? To me, it's very hard to assess. We stay on the level of cultural or theoretical labeling, because there's constitutional interpretation, there's reference to sovereignty. So a certain idea of constitution, the role of constitutional court, and so on. But are they compatible with the idea of a constitution based on pluralism and the need to balance competing or even rival rights and interests? Probably this is easier to verify. And this, at this level, we may try a normative, not only a cultural assessment. As to the good news, I also want to close with an optimistic stance. Science as an embankment against the populist drift. The science and the evidence and expert and scientific context can become a tool for both legislature, parliaments, and constitutional courts to contain populistic waves into the constitutional bed. And I just go very running through these possible tools. And I like to quote also Paolo Carrozza here, which, for instance, provide a very clear definition of evidence-based policy making. So the need to promote, also as a kind of constitutional duty, a process based on a scientific approach to the choices of parliamentary, governmental, and administrative bodies, capable of leading them back to a scientific methodology based on measurable and, to the degree of possible, verifiable data. And here you can find a shift in approach from, it was very easy, but from the Trump to the Biden administration. One of the first acts of the Biden administration was this President Memorandum of Restoring Trust in Government through Scientific Integrity and Evidence-Based Policy Making, where they write down the principle according to which to make evidence-based decisions guided by the best available science and data. Again, an open to science constitutional adjudication in abortion, but in many other contexts. And here I only can quote and refer to the, of course, pre-DOPS, some judgment where the US Supreme Court declared the unconstitutionality of some US state law, Texas, Louisiana, which pose substantial obstacles to access to abortion, the admitting privilege, the impact of the admitting privilege of clinic health care clinics over women's health and self-determination has been assessed in terms of constitutionality, not exclusively, but also on the ground of the medical evidence and the scientific reliability of these political choices. And again, look at science as a possible standard parameter within the constitutional adjudication. In the Italian doctrine, we refer to a kind of the need to assess also the scientific reasonableness of laws. And I'm quoting, especially for foreign scholars, some principle the Italian constitutional courts applied specifically for restoring the violation to reproductive rights, health rights of women. The Constitutional Court recognizes and applies and recognizes the existence of limits placed on legislative discretion by scientific and experimental finding on the one hand. And the court applies it, for instance, in the context of assisted reproductive technology in order to quash down an excessively restrictive legislation and because unreasonable and against the right to health of the woman, because the law does not allow doctor to assess on the basis of the most up-to-date and accredited technical scientific knowledge the individual case undergoing treatment. I skipped this, but just to this is we always say I skip, but then I go through this and just think about there's also a culture of counter-populistic, or more simply pluralistic or evolutionary reasoning in the constitutional adjudication. Let's compare this quoting of the Italian Constitutional Court referring to gender tradition 1985, that the court start recognizing that an evolving legal civilization, increasingly aware of the values, freedom, and dignity of the human person, which seeks and protects even in minority and atypical situation, looks at the understanding of the Polish Constitutional Court in 2020. A legal system is defined as a cultural creation embedded in the historical experience of the community and construed based on the system of values common to a given circle of subjects. So I think I don't have to comment enough. I just quote or refer to the a new frame, the idea of the reflective science and the link between equity in science in terms to represent within the scientific community all the social plurality, but also to use science, a good science, evidence-based science, for equity. And again, you can recall back to the Biden administration. To conclude, 1 minute more. So the dimension, 3 steps, the dimension of the constitutional interpretation and theory within the debate on populism and scientific populism. The duty to take pluralism seriously. So distinguish unconstitutional populism, which can be blocked by a provided constitutional safeguard, from a pre-constitutional populism, which can be considered as outside the constitutional perimeter. But may laws and policies built on populist rhetoric be intended as the expression of constitutional pluralism? Then there's the dimension of the effective protection of women's rights, especially, and unfortunately, women's body becomes a context of competition between different ideas and interpretation of constitution. And of course, we have the essential role of counter-majoritarian bodies, and then the role played by scientific expertise in defining the balance within competing interests. Last, we need to distinguish between a contextual and a structural populism, also in the scientific dimension. And maybe we can try to consider populism as an antigen able to activate the core constitutional antibodies. Of course, in order to do so, the constitutional machinery must function at its maximum efficiency, especially in its counter-majoritarian bodies. Thank you, and sorry for everything.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Simone. Yes, your remarks on the legal narratives on scientific, the instrumental use of scientific arguments. I think that they are also dangerous and tricky also because they present themselves as neutral arguments. And so this is a way to push into the background other arguments that maybe are less neutral. And at the same time, your remarks remind me of the instrumental use of some reasonings against some medical techniques in the United States on abortion. For instance, the path towards the overruling of Roe versus Wade started from the presentation of the ethical problems surrounding some techniques, the partial birth abortion. Actually, they were not so widespread, but they were used to, as symbolic arguments. Yes. Now, so we have the project officer. She's just joined us. So we will, I asked her if she wants to wait until the afternoon or if she has a tight schedule and if she wants to say a few remarks now.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I could not connect this morning, but I can intervene at 3:30 as planned. If it is fine for you, I can give a brief presentation on the Jean Monnet absence.
Thank you. Yes, if it's okay for you, I think that we can try to leave a few minutes for the debate. How much time do we have for the debate?
Debate over lunch, I would say. Debate over lunch. Because
Very short. Okay. Are there questions? Okay, is it better? Maybe it's better. Okay. So Elettra is suggesting to wait the afternoon for few questions for a debate, a short debate on the presentations in the morning. And of course, the okay. So it's maybe you have a few minutes. There are a few minutes left for the project officer. So maybe you can take advantage of the postponement of the debate to speak now as you like. It's up to you. Thank you.
Okay, it is fine for me. I can present now. It's a brief presentation, so it is fine. Firstly, thank you very much. I mean, for the invitation. I'm very glad to participate here today. To your first international, conference on gender, populism, and constitutional degradation in Europe and beyond, under the framework of the European Women's Law and Gender. That is a Jean Monnet chair. And this chair, it is very important because it contributes to the achievement of gender equality, but also to the elimination of anti-discrimination and the promotion of intersectionalities. And this is aligned, with the EU policies, as it is specifically, for example, in the EU gender equality strategy that it was signed, in 2020 and goes until 2025. So in the current political context where gender is quite, concerned, this type of initiatives, these types of projects are very relevant because it provides, knowledge, but also research. It raises awareness as well among different citizens, diverse, citizens, institutions, and this is really key because we are aware that populism, is always, dangerous to gender equality, in particular to women's rights, but also to the democracy in itself, no? Because women and men in all their diversity, we all have, equal rights and opportunities, equal access, to employment, to access to resources, education. So in this regard, we need to challenge, the gender norms, no, within our internal, our households, but also, in the outside, no. And recognize, the responsibilities that men do have, in the different spheres, but also to foster, we need to foster legislative developments in terms of gender equality, anti-discrimination, etc. So this type of projects that I will present you a few slides. They are not we don't have many in GenMonet focus on gender equality, so we consider that this is very important. And I'm going to share with you. Let me see. I have just a very brief presentation on. Let me see if I can. I don't know if you can you see it now. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay. I just would like to present you briefly in, the focus on the GenMonet actions that they are focused, in the EU dimension at policy level, but also the public diplomacy level. So at the EU dimension, for example, this program, because it promotes, the actions must promote, the European citizens, but also the founding values of the EU. For example, democracy, human rights, gender equality, that they are all, key elements of the Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. So this is really, this program is really a good example on how the EU dimension is covered. Also the EU policy, you have to connect, the programs needs to be connected with the EU policy in place. And this is the case, for example, again, this project is connected with the EU gender equality strategies. It share, the same priorities. And also regarding, the public diplomacy, it's how the projects, should promote, the EU values and enhance the visibility of what the European Union stands for and what intends also to achieve, no? So the GenMonet actions, so far, we have around almost 7,000 GenMonet actions in the field of the European studies. And what we refer for European studies, is the study of the Europe in the teaching, the learning, the research, but also about the European Union, the aims, the structure, the functions, but also the policies. Like this is the case, the gender policies and discrimination policies that we had in place, etc. And we are present in more than 100 countries worldwide, meaning that more than 1,000 universities, they're offering GenMonet courses since 1989. And around 9,000 teachers, university teachers, they are contributing every year, to this program. So the aims, I mean, of the Jamonet actions in the field of the higher educations, because there are other actions that now, for example, they are covering there. We have networks, we have also actions that they are covering in the schools. I mean, for higher education, the aims, it will be to promote the excellence in teaching and also research. I mean, to generate knowledge and insights regarding the EU policy making. Also reaching, I mean, new people, going beyond the academia and specialized audiences in order to bring closer the EU to the society, and fostering the dialogue also between among academia and the society, policymakers, civil servants, etc. And also the aim is to function as a vector for public diplomacy. So regarding, I mean, the award criteria, these are the main 4 criteria when we look at a proposal. Is the project, if it is relevant, I mean, how the quality, the project design, how it is the implementation, how it's going to be, the quality of the partnerships, the cooperation arrangement that they are going to do, and which is going to be the impact, this dissemination and sustainability. So all the proposals are screened under these 4 criteria. The type of actions that we have for higher education, I mean, it will be the modules, the chairs, like this is the case, and the Center of Excellence. Regarding, for example, the total amount of the awarded proposals that we have this year, we have 152 proposals. And for example, regarding models, in Italy, we have 34. Regarding chairs, in Italy, we have 21, and Center of Excellence, we have 8 in Italy. Italy is the country that has the higher number of awarded proposals, I mean, regarding all the countries. And the most common type of action is models. This represents almost 70% of the total of the proposals that they are awarded. And I just wanted to finish, I mean, regarding this is the type of proposals, and then as I said, European studies, it can be about any type of issue. I mean, the universities can propose. And regarding the focus on gender equality, for example, in 2013, only we have, I mean, 12 programs that they are focused on gender equality, 11 are modules, and 1 is a chair. And from last year, we have also 12. But we have, there is 8 modules and 4 chairs that we have last year. And mainly about countries, it's also Italy, one of the countries that has most of the progress and the projects that they are focused on gender equality. So we really think that, I mean, this is a very important issue that we should continue working. And I really wish you, I mean, the best in your discussions, I mean, this afternoon and tomorrow. So I'm open to any question that you may have. And thank you again.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay. I think there are no questions. So I thank very much the project officers for their contribution, for illustrating us the Jamonet actions. And so I think now we have pause for lunch, and we come back at 3:30. Okay. Okay, thank you.